December 2nd, 2024. Kodiak bear kills 3 fishermen in 10 minutes on Kodiak Island. The morning fog hung thick over Uyak Bay like a burial shroud, muffling the sound of diesel engines and the rhythmic slap of waves against aluminum hulls. At 5:47 a.m. Alaska Standard Time, the temperature held steady at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above the freezing point that would have made the work ahead nearly impossible. Alan Michael Foster, 43 years old and weathered by 2 decades of commercial fishing in the treacherous waters surrounding Kodiak Island, squinted through the windshield of his 20-foot Alumaweld Super V as he navigated the narrow channel between Harvester Island and the mainland. "Visibility's about 50 yards, he called over his shoulder to his younger brother Patrick, who was checking their nets for the 3rd time that morning. Patrick James Foster, 38, had been fishing these waters for 15 years, always in his older brother's shadow, but never complaining about it. Unlike Alan's steady, methodical approach to everything, Patrick possessed a restless energy that made him invaluable during the frantic salmon runs when every minute counted. "We're going to have to stay close to shore until this burns off." The 3rd man aboard the vessel, Jeremy Michael Cole, 35, sat hunched over a thermos of coffee that had already gone cold. Jeremy had been Alan's closest friend since they were 12 years old, growing up in the tight-knit fishing community of Kodiak City, where the Foster brothers shared the solid, stocky build common to men who worked the sea. Jeremy was tall and lanky, all sharp angles and nervous energy. He'd been having trouble sleeping for weeks, ever since his divorce papers had been finalized, and the dark circles under his hazel eyes made him look older than his years. "How far out are we planning to set today?" Jeremy asked, pulling his orange Grundens rain jacket tighter against the morning chill. His voice carried the slight rasp of a man who'd been smoking for 20 years, though he'd quit the previous month when his ex-wife Susan had threatened to use it against him in the custody battle for their 8-year-old daughter, Emma. Alan adjusted the throttle, slowing their approach as a cluster of sea otters appeared off the starboard bow, their sleek heads disappearing beneath the surface with barely a ripple. About 2 miles northeast of Terra Bay. Fish and Game says the silvers have been running thick through there all week. He paused to take a swig from his own coffee mug, a ceramic piece his wife Martha had made in her pottery class the previous winter. "Should be able to fill the hold if we work it right." The Alumaweld Super V, christened the Lucky Strike by Alan's father when he'd purchased it in 1998, was a testament to practical functionality over aesthetic appeal. 20 feet of welded aluminum hull, powered by a 150 horsepower Yamaha outboard that Alan maintained with the same meticulous care he applied to everything in his life. The boat's interior was cramped but efficient. Built-in fuel tanks, a small cuddy cabin forward for storage and weather protection, and plenty of deck space for handling nets and fish boxes. A VHF radio, GPS chart plotter, and fish finder completed the essential electronics, while a small Coleman stove bolted to the stern provided the only luxury, hot coffee and the occasional warm meal during long days on the water. Patrick finished his inspection of the nets and moved forward to join his brother at the helm. The gill nets they'd be deploying stretched 40 feet in length and 8 feet deep, constructed of monofilament mesh designed to catch salmon by their gills as they attempted to swim through. Each net required careful attention to prevent tangles that could cost hours to sort out, and in the competitive world of commercial fishing, time lost was money lost. The brothers had inherited their father's fishing permits when William Foster died of a heart attack 3 years earlier, and the pressure to maintain the family operation weighed heavily on both men. "Weather Service is calling for winds to pick up around noon," Patrick said, settling onto the bench seat beside Alan. 15 to 20 knots from the southwest. He pulled a worn baseball cap lower over his eyes and watched the fog swirl past their running lights. Think we'll have time to make a set before it gets too rough? Alan nodded, his attention split between the GPS display and the water ahead. They were passing through an area where the depth changed rapidly from 60 feet to over 200, an underwater cliff that created upwelling currents beloved by salmon and feared by fishermen. Should be fine if we get started by 7. Tide's perfect. Incoming for another 4 hours. Jeremy shifted restlessly on his seat, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had been building since they'd left the harbour in the pre-dawn darkness. He'd grown up hearing the old-timers' stories about Kodiak's brown bears, the largest subspecies of grizzly bear in the world, some weighing over 1,500 pounds and standing 10 feet tall on their hind legs. The island supported a population of approximately 3,500 bears, more per square mile than anywhere else on Earth, and while attacks on humans were rare, they were never forgotten. His grandfather, Thomas Cole, had been a salmon fisherman on Kodiak for 40 years before retiring in 1985, and Jeremy still remembered the old man's stories about bears swimming out to fishing boats drawn by the scent of fresh salmon. "Bears are smart," his grandfather would say, settling back in his recliner with a glass of bourbon. "Smarter than most people give them credit for. They know when the salmon are running, and they know where the boats go. You respect them. They'll usually leave you alone. But you never ever forget they're out there." The fog began to lift as they approached their intended fishing area, revealing the rugged coastline of Kodiak Island in the pale morning light. The landscape was both beautiful and forbidding. Towering mountains rising directly from the sea, their peaks shrouded in clouds, while dense forests of Sitka spruce and western hemlock covered the lower elevations. Patches of bright green alders marked the locations of freshwater streams where salmon would eventually spawn, and Jeremy could make out several waterfalls cascading down vertical cliff faces, their white ribbons disappearing into the sea with silent grace. "There," Alan said, pointing toward a slight indentation in the coastline about half a mile ahead. "That's where we'll make our first set." He reduced power to idle and let the boat drift while he studied the fish finder. The screen showed promising marks between 30 and 50 feet, the depth preferred by coho salmon during their feeding migrations. "Patrick, get ready to deploy. Jeremy, you're on the radio. Let the fleet know we're setting gear." The routine was familiar, performed hundreds of times over the years they'd been fishing together. Patrick moved to the stern and prepared the net for deployment, while Jeremy switched the VHF radio to channel 16. The international distress and calling frequency monitored by the Coast Guard and other commercial fishermen. "This is the fishing vessel Lucky Strike, WDF-2847, setting gill nets approximately 2 miles northeast of Terror Bay, over." Jeremy's voice carried clearly across the water, though he received no immediate response. The nearest commercial boats were probably still making their way out from the harbour, delayed by the same fog that had slowed their own departure. Alan positioned the boat at the beginning of their intended set, parallel to the shoreline and about 400 yards offshore. The water here ran deep close to shore, perfect for salmon, but requiring careful navigation to avoid the submerged rocks that dotted the area like sleeping giants. He'd been fishing this particular spot for over a decade and knew every boulder and current by heart. "Deploying net," Patrick called, lifting the first section over the transom. The monofilament mesh disappeared quickly beneath the surface, marked by a series of orange floats that would keep the top edge at the proper depth. Each float was connected to the net by precise lengths of line, a system perfected over decades of salmon fishing in Alaskan waters. Looking good so far. The net deployment took exactly 12 minutes, the Lucky Strike moving slowly along their predetermined course, while Patrick fed the mesh into the water with practiced efficiency. Alan monitored both the GPS and depth finder, ensuring they maintained proper position and depth. When the last section of net was deployed, he marked their location on the GPS and made a note in the logbook, 7:23 a.m., net deployed at 57 degrees, 23.4 minutes north, 153 degrees, 47.8 minutes west, water temperature 42 degrees, light northwest wind. "Now we wait," Alan said, shutting down the engine to reduce noise that might spook the salmon. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the distant cry of seagulls. "Give it 30 minutes, then we'll start hauling back." Jeremy poured fresh coffee from the thermos and settled onto the stern seat, watching the orange floats bob in the gentle swells. The sun was finally breaking through the overcast sky, sending shafts of golden light across the water and transforming the drab morning into something almost magical. For the first time in weeks, he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. This was why he kept coming back to the fishing life, despite the financial uncertainty and physical demands. Moments like this, when the world seemed reduced to its essential elements of water, sky, and the ancient rhythm of the tides. "Remember that time we were fishing out near Marmot Island?" Patrick said, settling beside Jeremy with his own cup of coffee. "And that bear swam out to the boat." He chuckled at the memory, though Jeremy noticed his brother's expression remained serious. Must have been 8, 9 years ago. Big sow with 2 cubs, just paddling along like she was out for a Sunday swim. Alan nodded, his eyes scanning the shoreline with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd spent his adult life in bear country. She came right up to within 20 feet of us, just floated there watching like she was trying to figure out what we were doing. He paused to sip his coffee, steam rising from the mug in the cool air. Bears are incredible swimmers. People don't realize that. They can swim for miles without getting tired. Jeremy felt the familiar chill that always accompanied talk of bears. He'd had several encounters over the years, mostly glimpses of brown shapes moving through the alders or along the beach, but each one had left him with a profound respect for the animal's power and unpredictability. "What did you do when she got that close?" "Nothing," Alan replied. "Just sat still and waited. She watched us for maybe 5 minutes, then turned around and swam back to shore with the cubs following behind. Never made a sound, never acted aggressive. Just curious, I think." He set down his coffee mug and reached for the binoculars, scanning the tree line along the shore. The key is not to panic. They can sense fear, and it makes them nervous too. The shoreline they were facing was typical of Kodiak's wilderness areas, a narrow strip of rocky beach backed by dense forest that extended inland for miles without a single sign of human habitation. The trees grew almost to the water's edge in many places, their branches creating dark tunnels where anything might be hiding. Jeremy studied the forest with growing unease, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. At 7:45 a.m., a light breeze began to stir the surface of the water, creating small wavelets that made the net floats dance hypnotically. The weather was holding better than expected, with visibility now extending to nearly a mile and the overcast beginning to break apart into scattered clouds. Alan started the engine and began the slow process of hauling back the net, hoping for the silver flash of salmon in the mesh. "Fish on!" Patrick called excitedly as the first section of net came aboard. A beautiful coho salmon, about 8 pounds, writhed in the mesh with the distinctive bright silver coloring that made them so prized by both commercial and sport fishermen. "And another one, this is looking good," the net continued to produce as they hauled it aboard, section by section. By the time they reached the halfway point, they had landed 7 coho salmon and 2 king salmon, including one magnificent 40-pound Chinook that would bring top dollar at the fish buyer's dock. Jeremy found himself relaxing for the first time all morning, caught up in the excitement of a successful set. Maybe this would be the day that started turning his luck around. It was 8:17 a.m. when Patrick first noticed something wrong with the net. "Alan, "Come look at this," he called, his voice tight with concern. The section of net he was hauling showed clear signs of damage. Several feet of mesh had been torn completely away, leaving ragged edges that spoke of tremendous force. Something big hit this. Alan cut the engine and moved to examine the damaged section. The monofilament had been shredded with a precision that ruled out propeller damage or rocky bottom contact. Something with claws and tremendous strength had ripped through the mesh like it was tissue paper. Seal, maybe, or sea lion. They've been bad this year for tearing up gear. But Jeremy was studying the damage pattern with growing alarm. He'd seen seal damage before, and this was different, more systematic, more deliberate. The tears followed a pattern that suggested whatever had caused them was trying to reach something specific within the net. "Look at this," he said, pointing to claw marks gouged deep into one of the aluminum floats. "Those aren't seal claws." The three men stared at the damaged float in silence. The claw marks were unmistakable. 4 parallel gouges, each nearly an inch deep and perfectly spaced. Only one animal in these waters possessed claws of that size and strength. A brown bear had found their net and decided to investigate. "We need to get this gear aboard and get out of here," Alan said quietly, his earlier calm replaced by focused urgency. "If there's a bear in the water, we don't want to be between it and wherever it's trying to go." They worked in silence to haul the remaining net, moving with the efficient haste of men who understood their situation. The damage extended through nearly 20 feet of mesh, representing hundreds of dollars in repairs and lost fishing time. More concerning were the implications of a bear actively hunting in the water this far from shore. Brown bears were excellent swimmers, but they rarely ventured into deep water unless driven by hunger or territorial pressure. At 8:34 a.m., Jeremy spotted movement along the shoreline through the binoculars. "There," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About 200 yards north of where we set, something big moving through the trees." Alan took the binoculars and focused on the indicated area. For several seconds, he saw nothing but the natural movement of branches in the morning breeze. Then a shadow that was too large and too purposeful to be anything but a bear emerged from the forest. Even at nearly 400 yards distance, the animal's size was impressive, easily 8 feet tall at the shoulder and massively built through the chest and shoulders. "Boar," Alan said, passing the binoculars to Patrick. "Big one, probably pushing 1,200 pounds. He started the engine and began moving slowly away from shore, maintaining their distance while keeping the bear in sight. "He's been feeding on salmon. Look at the condition he's in." Patrick studied the bear through the binoculars, noting the thick layer of fat that spoke of successful feeding throughout the summer and fall months. The animal's coat was the rich chocolate brown typical of Kodiak bears, with lighter tips on the guard hairs that gave him an almost grizzled appearance. Most disturbing was the bear's behavior. Instead of moving along the beach in the typical foraging pattern, he was standing motionless among the trees, apparently watching their boat. "He's looking at us," Patrick said, his voice tight with concern, "just standing there staring right at us." Jeremy took the binoculars and confirmed his friend's observation. The bear was indeed focused on their boat, his massive head turning to track their movement as Alan continued their slow retreat. The animal's posture was alert, but not overtly aggressive, yet something about his stillness was deeply unsettling. "How long do they usually watch like that?" "Not long," Alan replied, his hands steady on the wheel despite the tension he felt building in his chest. "Most bears will look you over for a minute or two, then go back to whatever they were doing. This one's been watching us for nearly 5 minutes. The bear began moving along the shoreline, paralleling their course with a purposeful gait that sent alarm bells ringing in all three men's minds. He was large enough to be an apex predator with no natural enemies, old enough to have learned that humans sometimes carried food, and smart enough to recognize the scent signature of fresh salmon that clung to their boat and nets. "Alan," Jeremy said quietly, "I think we should call this in." "Call what in?" Alan replied, though he was already reaching for the VHF radio microphone. "Coast Guard. This is fishing vessel Lucky Strike WDF-2847, approximately 2 miles northeast of Terror Bay. We have a large brown bear on shore showing unusual interest in our fishing operations. Requesting advisement on whether other vessels have reported similar sightings. Over." The response came immediately from the Coast Guard station in Kodiak. "Lucky Strike, this is Coast Guard Group Kodiak. Copy your report of bear activity. Are you in immediate danger? Over." Alan considered the question while watching the bear continue its parallel course along the beach. The animal showed no signs of entering the water, and they were maintaining a safe distance of nearly 300 yards. "Negative, Coast Guard. Animal is on shore, we're maintaining distance. Just wanted to report unusual behavior in case other vessels are working the area. Over." "Copy, Lucky Strike. Be advised we have no other reports of aggressive bear behavior in your area today. Recommend maintaining safe distance and monitoring situation. Coast Guard Group Kodiak out." Jeremy felt only slightly reassured by the radio exchange. The Coast Guard's advice was sound: maintain distance and monitor the situation, but it did nothing to address the growing sense of unease that had settled over all three men. The bear was now approximately a quarter-mile north of their position, still moving parallel to their course, and still watching their boat with what seemed like deliberate intent. "We should head back," Patrick said, coiling the last of the damaged net with mechanical precision. "Come back tomorrow when he's moved on to somewhere else." Alan was torn between caution and the practical need to make a living. They'd already invested hours in the morning's fishing, and the catch, while respectable, wasn't enough to cover their fuel costs and boat payments. The weather was holding better than forecast, and there were other productive areas they could work that were well away from their current position. "One more set," he decided. "We'll move south, down toward Raspberry Island. Put some distance between us and our friend there, then make another set in the kelp beds. If he shows up again, we're done for the day." The decision seemed reasonable at 8:47 a.m. as they pulled away from the bear's position and headed southwest toward a productive fishing area they'd worked successfully the week before. The bear disappeared from view as they rounded a small point of land, and the immediate sense of danger began to fade as the distance increased between them and the shore. Jeremy settled back into his seat and tried to shake off the lingering unease. He'd been fishing Kodiak waters for 15 years and had encountered dozens of bears without incident. The animals were a constant presence in the region, part of the natural order that every fisherman learned to respect and work around. There was no reason to think this morning's encounter was anything more than curiosity on the bear's part and overactive imagination on his own. The kelp beds off Raspberry Island stretched for nearly 2 miles along the shore, their thick brown fronds creating underwater forests that provided habitat for the small fish that salmon fed on during their oceanic migrations. The water here ran between 60 and 80 feet deep, with a sandy bottom broken by occasional rocky outcroppings that held sea urchins and other delicacies prized by both fish and fishermen. Alan positioned the Lucky Strike at the northern edge of the kelp beds, studying the fish finder for signs of salmon. The screen showed promising marks between 40 and 60 feet, scattered but consistent, exactly the pattern they hoped to see. "Looks good," he announced, preparing to deploy their second net of the day. "Patrick, get ready. Jeremy, mark our position." The second net deployment went smoothly, taking place in calmer water with better visibility than their morning set. By 9:15 a.m. they had 400 feet of net fishing the kelp beds, marked by a string of orange floats that disappeared into the distance like beads on an invisible string. The sun was now fully up, burning away the last wisps of fog and revealing the full grandeur of the Kodiak landscape. "Beautiful morning," Patrick said, settling back with another cup of coffee. The tension of their bear encounter was beginning to fade, replaced by the comfortable routine of fishing that had defined their adult lives. Days like this make all the rough weather worth it. Jeremy nodded, pulling out his cell phone to check for messages from his ex-wife about their daughter. Emma had a soccer game that afternoon, and he was hoping to make it back in time to watch her play. The divorce had been finalized only 6 weeks earlier, but they were still working out the logistics of shared custody and trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life for their daughter's sake. "How's Emma doing with everything?" Alan asked, noticing Jeremy's distracted expression as he scrolled through text messages. Alan and Martha had been unable to have children of their own, and they'd become unofficial uncle and aunt to Emma over the years, taking genuine interest in her welfare. "She's handling it better than Susan and I are, honestly," Jeremy replied, putting the phone away without finding any new messages. "Kids are resilient. She just wants things to be normal again, whatever that means." He gazed across the water toward the distant mountains, thinking about the small apartment he'd rented in town, and how empty it felt without Emma's laughter echoing through the rooms. The VHF radio crackled to life with routine chatter from other commercial fishermen working the area. The fishing vessel Arctic Dawn reported good catches near Shelikof Strait, while the Northern Pride was having engine problems and heading back to port. Jeremy found the familiar voices comforting, a reminder that they were part of a larger community of men and women who made their living from the sea. At 9:43 a.m., Patrick noticed something wrong with their net floats. "Alan, look at the floats. They're moving against the current." Alan studied the line of orange markers and immediately saw what his brother meant. The floats were being pulled southward against the natural north-flowing current, indicating that something large was moving through the net from the north. "Could be a school of salmon," he said hopefully, though his instincts told him otherwise. Salmon didn't move through nets with enough force to drag the floats against a strong current. "Or it could be him," Jeremy said quietly, raising the binoculars to scan the shoreline. "Our friend from this morning." The shoreline near their current position was more broken than where they'd fished earlier, with several small bays and rocky promontories that provided perfect concealment for a large animal. Jeremy methodically searched each potential hiding spot, looking for the telltale brown shape that would confirm his growing suspicions. He found the bear at 9:46 a.m., standing motionless on a rocky point approximately 500 yards to the northeast. The animal was closer to the water than he'd been during their morning encounter, and his posture suggested focused attention rather than casual curiosity. "There he is," Jeremy said, handing the binoculars to Alan. "Same bear. He followed us." Alan studied the bear through the binoculars, noting details he'd missed during their earlier sighting. The animal bore several scars across his muzzle and forehead, evidence of fights with other bears or perhaps encounters with porcupines. His ears were small in proportion to his massive head, and his eyes held an intelligence that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Most concerning was his position relative to their fishing operation. He'd placed himself between their boat and the most direct route back to the harbour. "He's learning our pattern," Alan said, passing the binoculars to Patrick. "Bears are smart. They watch fishermen and figure out where the fish are most likely to be." Patrick studied the bear while considering their options. The animal was too far away to pose an immediate threat, but his behavior suggested a level of interest that went beyond normal curiosity. "How long have you been fishing these waters, Alan? Have you ever seen anything like this?" Alan considered the question carefully. In 20 years of commercial fishing around Kodiak, he'd encountered hundreds of bears under various circumstances. Most were simply going about their business of foraging along the beach or fishing in the streams. Some had shown interest in fishing boats, but usually only briefly before moving on to other activities. This bear's sustained attention and apparent tracking behavior was something new. "Never seen one follow a boat like this," he admitted. "They'll watch you sometimes, maybe even swim out for a closer look. But following from spot to spot, that's different." The net floats were now moving more decisively against the current, and Alan made the decision to begin hauling back immediately. Whatever was interacting with their gear needed to be dealt with quickly, before the net sustained serious damage or became completely fouled. "Patrick, let's get this net aboard. Something's wrong down there." They began hauling back at 9:52 a.m., the hydraulic puller straining against unusual resistance in the net. The first section came aboard normally, containing 2 nice coho salmon and a small halibut that would make excellent table fare. But as they continued hauling, the damage became apparent. Another section of net had been systematically shredded, this time over a span of nearly 30 feet. "Same pattern as before," Patrick observed, examining the torn mesh. "Something with claws, working methodically through the net." He held up a section where the monofilament had been cut so cleanly it looked like knife work. "This isn't random damage from a seal or sea lion. This is purposeful." Jeremy was watching the bear through binoculars while his friends dealt with the damaged net. The animal had moved closer to the water's edge and was now standing in the surf, apparently testing the depth with his massive paws. "He's coming into the water," Jeremy announced, his voice tight with alarm, "wading out from shore." Alan looked up from the damaged net to see the bear now chest-deep in the surf, moving with surprising grace through water that would knock most humans off their feet. The animal's massive bulk was supported effortlessly by his powerful swimming strokes, and his direction of travel was unmistakably toward their boat. "Start the engine," Alan ordered, abandoning the net to move toward the helm. "We're leaving, now." The Yamaha outboard fired immediately, its 150 horsepower rumbling to life with reassuring power. Alan engaged the forward gear and began backing away from their net, sacrificing several $100s worth of gear to maintain distance from the approaching bear. The animal was still nearly 200 yards away, but covering that distance with steady, powerful strokes that spoke of tremendous endurance. "How fast can they swim?" Jeremy asked, securing loose gear as the boat began to move through the water. "Fast enough," Alan replied grimly, pushing the throttle forward to increase their speed. The Lucky Strike's hull rose up onto plane, its bow lifting as they accelerated away from the swimming bear. "But not faster than this boat." They had pulled away to a safe distance of nearly half a mile when the bear stopped swimming and began treading water, his massive head just visible above the surface. For several minutes he remained in position, apparently studying their boat, then turned and began swimming back toward shore with the same steady stroke that had carried him out. "What the hell was that about?" Patrick asked, his voice shaking slightly with delayed reaction to the encounter. "Bears don't just swim out after boats. Not unless there's something they really want." Alan was studying their position on the GPS, calculating distances and options. They were now nearly 3 miles from the harbor, with damaged nets and a bear that had demonstrated both the ability and willingness to follow them from fishing spot to fishing spot. The morning's fishing had been moderately successful, but the gear damage and lost fishing time were serious financial blows they could ill afford. "Could be the smell of salmon on our nets," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe the explanation. "Or maybe he's just territorial. Some of these old boars get pretty aggressive about their feeding areas." Jeremy was watching the bear through binoculars as it swam back to shore. The animal's behavior remained purposeful and intelligent, showing none of the random aggression that might be expected from a confused or frightened animal. When it reached the beach, the bear shook itself vigorously, sending spray flying in all directions, then disappeared into the tree line with surprising speed for something so large. "I say we head back," Jeremy said, lowering the binoculars. "Cut our losses and try again tomorrow. Maybe work a different area entirely." Alan was torn between caution and the practical need to salvage something from the day's fishing. The weather was still holding. They had several hours of daylight remaining, and there were productive fishing areas to the south that should be well away from their persistent follower. On the other hand, the bear had already demonstrated the ability to track them from location to location, and there was no guarantee that distance would discourage him. "One more try," Alan decided. "We'll head south toward Narrow Cape. That's 10 miles from here. If he follows us that far, we'll know we've got a real problem." The decision to continue fishing would later be questioned by investigators, family members, and the fishing community at large. With the benefit of hindsight, it seemed obvious that they should have returned to port immediately after the bear's second approach. But commercial fishing was a business of calculated risks, and the three men had no way of knowing that their morning encounters were simply the prelude to something far more deadly. The run south toward Narrow Cape took 45 minutes through increasingly rough water as the wind began to pick up from the southwest. The Lucky Strike handled the conditions well, her deep V hull cutting through the swells with the steady rhythm that made her a favorite among Kodiak fishermen. Jeremy spent most of the transit watching their wake for signs of pursuit, but saw nothing except the occasional seabird and the white caps that were beginning to form on the wave crests. Narrow Cape was a prominent headland that jutted several miles into the Gulf of Alaska, creating upwelling currents that attracted both bait fish and the salmon that fed on them. The fishing here could be spectacular when conditions were right, but it was also exposed to the full fury of Gulf storms and required careful attention to weather conditions. Alan positioned the boat in 80 feet of water about a mile offshore from the Cape, studying the fish finder for signs of salmon. The screen showed scattered marks between 40 and 70 feet, not as concentrated as he'd hoped, but promising enough to justify a set. The wind was now blowing 15 knots from the southwest, creating short, steep waves that made boat handling more challenging, but were still well within their comfort zone. "This'll be our last set for the day," he announced, preparing to deploy their third and final net. "Wind's supposed to build through the afternoon, and I don't want to get caught out here if it really starts blowing." The net deployment at Narrow Cape began at 11:23 a.m. under clearing skies and building seas. Patrick worked efficiently in the stern, feeding mesh into the water while maintaining his balance on the increasingly active deck. Jeremy monitored the radio and GPS, marking their position and listening to weather updates from other boats in the area. "Net's fishing," Patrick called, securing the final float line to a stern cleat. 400 feet, running northeast to southwest along the bottom contour. He wiped salt spray from his face and moved forward to join his companions in the boat's small cuddy cabin. "Now we see if we can make this day pay for itself." The wind continued to build as they waited for their net to fish, and by noon the waves were running 3 to 4 feet with occasional larger sets that sent spray over the bow. The Lucky Strike handled the conditions well, but the increasing motion made simple tasks like pouring coffee or checking equipment more challenging. "Weather's building faster than forecast," Alan observed, studying the darkening sky to the southwest. "We'll give this net 30 minutes, then haul back and head for home regardless of what we've caught." Jeremy was watching the shoreline of Narrow Cape through binoculars, scanning for any sign of their morning visitor. The Cape's rugged coastline offered numerous vantage points for a large predator, and the afternoon shadows were making visual identification increasingly difficult. "Can't see anything moving on shore," he reported. "Maybe we finally lost him." Patrick was checking their catch from the morning's fishing, ensuring the salmon were properly iced and stored in the fish holds. Despite the gear damage and lost fishing time, they had landed nearly 200 pounds of high-quality fish that would bring good prices at the dock. "Not a complete loss," he said, closing the hold lid, "but we need to get these nets repaired before we can fish again." The VHF radio crackled with increased chatter as the weather deteriorated. Several boats reported heading for shelter, and the Coast Guard issued a small craft advisory for the waters around Kodiak Island. Wind speeds were now consistently above 20 knots, with gusts to 30, and the seas were building to 6 feet in the more exposed areas. At 12:18 p.m., Allen made the decision to haul back their net and head for port. The weather was deteriorating more rapidly than forecast, and prudence demanded they get their catch safely back to the harbor before conditions became truly dangerous. "That's it for today," he announced, starting the engine and moving into position to begin hauling their gear. The net came aboard more easily than their previous sets, though the motion of the boat in the building seas made the work more challenging. Patrick worked steadily in the stern, coiling the wet mesh despite the spray that soaked him with each wave that broke over the transom. The catch was disappointing, only 6 salmon and a small halibut, but the net showed no signs of damage. "At least something went right," Patrick said, securing the last of the net in the stern. No bear damage this time. Jeremy was stowing loose gear and preparing the boat for the rough ride back to the harbor when he noticed something wrong with their wake. Instead of the clean, straight line of disturbed water that should have marked their passage, there was a second disturbance running parallel to their course, about 50 yards to starboard. "Allen," he called, his voice tight with sudden alarm, "look at the water off our starboard side." Allen glanced in the indicated direction and immediately saw what had caught Jeremy's attention. A V-shaped wake was moving through the water parallel to their course, too large and too purposeful to be anything but a large animal swimming just beneath the surface. The wake was maintaining their exact speed and heading, staying precisely 50 yards away, as if paced by some unseen intelligence. "Son of a bitch," Allen breathed, pushing the throttle forward to increase their speed. The Lucky Strike accelerated smoothly, her bow rising as she climbed onto plane, but the parallel wake accelerated as well, maintaining its precise distance and heading. "He's been following us underwater." The implications were terrifying. The bear had not only tracked them 10 miles south from their morning fishing location, but had apparently been swimming beneath the surface, pacing their boat while remaining invisible to their watchful eyes. The level of intelligence and determination required for such behavior was far beyond anything they had expected from even the largest brown bear. "How long do you think he's been there?" Patrick asked, joining his brother at the helm while keeping his eyes fixed on the mysterious wake. "Could be since we started fishing," Allen replied, adjusting their course toward the harbor while monitoring the parallel wake. "Could be longer. There's no way to tell how far underwater he's been swimming." Jeremy was studying the wake through binoculars, trying to catch a glimpse of the animal creating it. The water was too rough and the disturbance too deep to see anything clearly, but the wake's consistency suggested something large and powerful, swimming with remarkable endurance. "Bears can swim for miles," he said, remembering stories from his grandfather. "But this is different. This is hunting behavior." The parallel wake continued for another 10 minutes as they ran toward the harbor, maintaining its precise distance and speed regardless of Allen's attempts to alter course or speed. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the wake vanished, leaving only the normal turbulence of their passage through the increasingly rough water. "Where did he go?" Patrick asked, scanning the water around their boat for any sign of their pursuer. Allen continued toward the harbor at full throttle, unwilling to slow down until they reached the safety of the protected harbor. The wind was now howling at 30 knots, driving spray across the deck in sheets and creating seas that tested even the Lucky Strike's seaworthiness. "Maybe he gave up," he said hopefully. "Maybe he finally decided we weren't worth the effort." The entrance to Kodiak Harbour was a welcome sight when it appeared through the spray and driving rain at 1:47 p.m. The protective breakwaters cut the wave action dramatically, creating a pocket of relatively calm water where dozens of commercial fishing boats rode at their moorings. Alan throttled back as they entered the harbour, the sudden reduction in motion making all three men realise how tense they had become during their rough ride home. "Dock or mooring?" Patrick asked, preparing lines and fenders for their arrival. "Dock," Alan replied without hesitation. "I want to get these fish unloaded and the boat secured. Something tells me we're going to want to be on dry land for a while." They were tying up at their assigned slip when Jeremy noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh claw marks scored the concrete float where they normally moored. 4 parallel gouges, exactly like the ones they'd seen on their damaged net floats. The marks were still wet, indicating they had been made recently, possibly within the last few minutes. "Look at this," Jeremy said quietly, pointing to the damaged concrete. "He was here. He's been here." Alan and Patrick examined the claw marks in stunned silence. The gouges were deep enough to have required tremendous force, and their location on the dock suggested that a very large bear had hauled himself out of the water at their exact mooring location. The timing was impossible to determine precisely, but the wet concrete indicated the marks were fresh. "How could he have gotten here ahead of us?" Patrick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were doing 30 knots. No bear can swim that fast." Alan was studying the harbour approaches, trying to work out how a swimming bear could have reached their dock before their boat. The only explanation was that the animal had anticipated their destination and taken a more direct route while they were hauling their nets and securing their gear. The level of planning and intelligence required for such behaviour was deeply disturbing. "We need to report this," Jeremy said, reaching for his cell phone. "This isn't normal bear behaviour. This is something else entirely." The Alaska Department of Fish and Game office in Kodiak was closed for lunch when Jeremy called, but he left a detailed message describing their encounters with the bear and the evidence they had found at the harbour. He also called the Kodiak Police Department, though he wasn't sure if bear stalking fell under their jurisdiction. While Jeremy made his phone calls, Alan and Patrick worked to unload their catch and secure their boat. Both men found themselves constantly scanning the water and the dock area for any sign of the bear, and both jumped when a harbour seal surfaced near their boat with a loud snort. "I don't like this," Patrick said, coiling their dock lines with nervous energy. "Bears don't act like this. There's something wrong with this animal." Alan was inclined to agree, but he was also trying to maintain some perspective on their situation. They had encountered a large brown bear that showed unusual interest in their fishing activities, but no one had been hurt and no direct threat had been made. The claw marks on the dock could have been made at any time and might not even be related to their morning encounters. "Maybe we're overreacting," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. "We'll talk to Fish and Game tomorrow, get their take on the situation. If they think there's a problem bear in the area, they can deal with it." Jeremy finished his phone calls and rejoined his friends at the boat. The harbour was bustling with activity as other fishing vessels returned from their day's work, and the normal sounds of diesel engines and calling gulls provided a comforting backdrop of normalcy. "Fish and Game will have someone call me back this afternoon," he reported. "Police said to call them if we see the bear again, but there's not much they can do about an animal that hasn't actually threatened anyone." The three men finished securing their boat and headed for the harbour office to report their catch and check on weather forecasts for the following day. The storm that was building in the Gulf of Alaska was predicted to bring winds of 40 to 50 knots by evening, effectively shutting down fishing operations for at least 2 days. Under normal circumstances, this would have been welcome news, an opportunity to repair their damaged nets and catch up on boat maintenance. But given the morning's events, the prospect of being trapped ashore while an unpredictable bear roamed the area was less than appealing. "I'm going to stay at the boat tonight," Alan announced as they walked up the ramp from the docks. "Keep an eye on things. Make sure nothing happens to our gear." Patrick looked at his brother with concern. "You really think that's necessary?" "It's just a bear, Alan. A big bear, but still just an animal." Alan wasn't sure how to articulate the feeling of unease that had been building throughout the day. The encounters with the bear had been unsettling, but it was more than that. There had been an intelligence in the animal's behavior that went beyond simple curiosity or even predatory interest. The systematic damage to their nets, the tracking behavior, and especially the apparent anticipation of their return to the harbor suggested something far more complex than normal bear behavior. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I'll sleep better knowing the boat's secure." Jeremy was checking his phone for messages from his ex-wife when the call came from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The caller identified himself as Robert Chen, a wildlife biologist who specialized in brown bear management on Kodiak Island. "Mr. Cole, I got your message about encounters with a large brown bear. Can you give me some more details about what you observed?" Jeremy recounted the day's events in detail, describing the bear's behavior, the damage to their nets, and the evidence they'd found at the harbor. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about distances, times, or specific behaviors. "This is very unusual behavior," Chen said when Jeremy finished his account. "We've had reports of bears showing interest in fishing boats, but nothing like the systematic tracking you're describing, and the anticipation of your return to the harbor. That suggests a level of learning and planning that's quite remarkable." "Is it dangerous?" Jeremy asked. "Should we be worried about fishing in that area again?" Chen was quiet for a moment, clearly considering his response carefully. "Any encounter with a large brown bear has inherent risks," he said finally. "But this level of focused attention on specific individuals is concerning. I'd recommend avoiding the areas where you encountered the bear for at least several weeks. Give him time to lose interest and move on to other activities." "What if he doesn't lose interest?" Jeremy asked. "What if he keeps showing up wherever we go fishing?" "Then we'd be dealing with a very unusual situation that might require management intervention," Chen replied. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Most bears, even persistent ones, will eventually lose interest if the reward isn't worth the effort. Avoid the areas where you saw him and let me know immediately if you have any other encounters." Jeremy thanked Chen for his time and relayed the conversation to Alan and Patrick. The biologist's advice was sound: avoid the bear and hope he lost interest. But it also meant giving up some of their most productive fishing areas during the critical final weeks of the salmon season. "We can fish other areas," Alan said, though his tone suggested the decision was costing him. "Plenty of good water around the island that we haven't tried yet this season." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the harbor, repairing their damaged nets and discussing plans for the following day's fishing. The work was familiar and comforting, a routine that helped restore some sense of normalcy after the morning's unsettling encounters. Other fishermen stopped by to chat and compare notes on the day's fishing, and gradually the bear began to seem like just another of the challenges they faced in their chosen profession. As evening approached and the storm winds began to howl through the harbor, Alan made good on his promise to spend the night aboard the Lucky Strike. He set up a sleeping bag in the boat's small cuddy cabin and settled in to monitor the docks and surrounding water. Patrick and Jeremy headed home to their respective families, but both promised to check in regularly throughout the night. Alan's vigil aboard the Lucky Strike was largely uneventful through the early evening hours. The storm brought driving rain and winds that howled through the rigging of moored boats, creating a symphony of creaks, groans, and rhythmic clanging that was oddly comforting to someone who had spent his adult life around boats and harbours. He dozed fitfully in his sleeping bag, waking periodically to check the dock lines and scan the water for any unusual activity. It was 11:47 p.m. when Alan was awakened by a sound that didn't belong to the normal harbour symphony, a rhythmic splashing that suggested something large moving through the water near the docks. He sat up in his sleeping bag and listened intently, trying to distinguish the sound from the wind and wave noise of the storm. The splashing continued, moving slowly along the line of moored boats like something conducting a systematic search. Alan reached for his flashlight and crept forward to peer through the boat's small cabin window. The beam of his light revealed nothing but rain and wind-blown spray, but the splashing sound was definitely getting closer. At 11:52 p.m., Alan got his first clear view of their tormentor. A massive brown bear was swimming slowly between the moored boats, his great head just visible above the surface as he methodically investigated each vessel. The animal was enormous even by Kodiak standards, easily 12 feet long and probably weighing close to 1,500 pounds. His small ears were pressed flat against his skull, and his eyes reflected the beam of Alan's flashlight with an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. The bear reached the Lucky Strike at 11:55 p.m. and stopped, treading water just 20 feet from the boat while studying Alan through the cabin window. For several minutes, man and bear regarded each other in silence, separated by nothing more than 20 feet of dark water and the thin aluminum hull of a fishing boat. The bear showed no signs of aggression, but his attention was focused and unwavering. Alan reached for his cell phone to call for help, but realized immediately that there was no help to call. The police could not respond to an animal swimming in the harbour, and Fish and Game would not attempt a capture operation in the middle of a storm. He was on his own, face to face with the largest predator in North America. The bear began swimming slowly around the Lucky Strike, apparently studying the boat from all angles. Alan tracked the animal's movement through the cabin windows, his flashlight beam following the massive form as it completed a full circle of inspection. The bear's behavior was methodical and purposeful, showing none of the random curiosity that might be expected from a confused or frightened animal. After completing his inspection, the bear positioned himself at the stern of the boat and placed his massive paws on the transom. Alan felt the Lucky Strike settle slightly in the water as the animal's weight was transferred to the boat, and he realized with growing horror that the bear was preparing to climb aboard. The transom of the Lucky Strike was only 18 inches above the waterline, easily within reach of a motivated brown bear. Alan watched in fascination and terror as the animal gathered himself for what appeared to be an attempt to haul himself out of the water and onto the boat's stern deck. It was at that moment that Alan made a decision that would save his life. Instead of remaining frozen in the cabin, he moved quickly to the helm and started the boat's engine. The sudden roar of the 150-horsepower Yamaha outboard broke the night's relative quiet and caused the bear to release his hold on the transom and back away from the boat. Alan immediately put the engine in reverse and backed away from the dock, dragging his mooring lines through the water as he put distance between himself and the swimming bear. The animal made no attempt to pursue, but remained treading water near the dock while Alan maneuvered the Lucky Strike to the far side of the harbour. From his new position nearly a quarter-mile away, Alan watched through binoculars as the bear hauled himself out of the water onto the dock where the Lucky Strike had been moored. Even at that distance, the animal's size was impressive as he shook himself vigorously and then began what appeared to be a systematic inspection of the dock area. Alan spent the remainder of the night anchored in the middle of the harbour, taking turns between watching the bear and trying to contact authorities. He finally reached Robert Chen, the fish and game biologist, at his home number. "Mr. Chen, this is Alan Foster. I'm sorry to wake you, but we have a situation at the harbour. That bear my friend called about earlier. He's here, and he just tried to climb onto my boat." Chen was instantly alert. "Are you safe?" "Where are you now?" "I'm anchored in the harbour about a quarter-mile from the docks. The bear hauled himself out onto the dock and appears to be searching the area where my boat was moored." "This is very serious," Chen said. "A bear that's willing to approach boats at night and attempt to board them represents a significant public safety threat. I'm going to mobilize our response team immediately. Can you stay where you are until we arrive?" "I'm not going anywhere," Alan replied, watching the distant bear through his binoculars. "But I don't think this animal is going to be easily discouraged. There's something different about him." Chen arrived at the harbour at 6:30 a.m. with a team of wildlife officers and specialized equipment for dealing with problem bears. By then, the bear had disappeared, leaving only the gouged concrete of the dock and a trail of massive paw prints leading up the boat ramp and into the town of Kodiak itself. The implications were sobering. A 1,500-pound brown bear had spent the night roaming through a community of nearly 14,000 people, searching for something or someone with single-minded determination. The fact that no one had been hurt was more a matter of luck than planning. "We're going to have to destroy this animal," Chen told Alan as they examined the claw marks on the dock. "This level of habituated behavior toward humans is extremely dangerous. If he's willing to enter the harbour and attempt to board boats, he's crossed a line that we can't allow him to cross." Alan felt a complex mix of emotions at Chen's pronouncement. The bear had terrified him and threatened his livelihood, but there was also a grudging respect for the animal's intelligence and determination. In a strange way, he felt responsible for the bear's fate. If they had returned to port immediately after their first encounter, the animal might never have escalated to such dangerous behavior. "What happens now?" Alan asked. "We track him down and eliminate the threat," Chen replied grimly, "and we pray that he doesn't hurt anyone before we find him." The hunt for the bear began immediately, with teams of wildlife officers and local hunters scouring the area around Kodiak for any sign of the animal. The storm had passed during the night, leaving clear skies and calm winds that made tracking easier, but also providing the bear with unlimited options for concealment in the island's vast wilderness. Patrick and Jeremy arrived at the harbour as the search teams were organizing their efforts. Both men listened to Alan's account of the night's events with growing amazement and concern. The bear's behavior had moved well beyond anything that could be considered normal, entering territory that suggested either illness, injury, or a level of intelligence that was deeply disturbing. "Maybe we should stay ashore for a few days," Jeremy suggested. "Let them deal with this situation before we go back out fishing." Alan was inclined to agree, but the practical realities of commercial fishing made the decision complicated. Every day they spent tied to the dock was a day of lost income, and the salmon season was drawing to a close. If they missed too many days, the financial impact could affect their ability to maintain their boats and equipment through the winter months. "We'll give it 24 hours, Alan decided. "If they haven't found him by tomorrow, we'll have to make some hard choices about whether to keep fishing." The search team spent the day following the bear's trail through the town of Kodiak, tracking massive paw prints along streets and through residential areas. The animal had apparently spent several hours exploring the community, investigating garbage cans, parked cars, and even approaching several houses where the scent of cooking food might have attracted his attention. Remarkably, no one reported seeing the bear during his nocturnal wandering through town. The combination of storm conditions and the late hour had kept most residents indoors, and the bear had apparently moved with surprising stealth for something so large. His trail ended at the water's edge on the far side of town, suggesting he had returned to the sea before dawn. "He's gone back to the water," Chen reported to Alan later that afternoon. "We've lost his trail at the north end of town. He could be anywhere along 50 miles of coastline by now." The implications were clear. The bear had not been deterred by his encounter with Alan at the harbour and might continue to pose a threat to other fishermen working the waters around Kodiak Island. Chen issued advisories to all commercial fishing operators, warning them about the unusually aggressive bear and recommending that they work in groups whenever possible. "This animal has demonstrated remarkable intelligence and persistence," Chen's advisory read. "He has shown the ability to track specific boats over long distances and to anticipate their movements. All commercial fishing operators should exercise extreme caution when working in the waters around Kodiak Island, particularly in the Terror Bay, Raspberry Island and Narrow Cape areas where encounters have been reported." The advisory created considerable discussion within Kodiak's fishing community. Bears were a constant presence in the region, but most fishermen had limited experience with animals that showed such focused attention on human activities. The consensus was that this was either a very unusual individual or an animal that was suffering from some form of illness or injury that was affecting his behavior. Alan spent the evening at home with his wife Martha, trying to process the events of the previous 36 hours. Martha was a practical woman who had spent her adult life married to a commercial fisherman, and she understood both the risks and the economic realities of their chosen profession. But the story Alan told her was unlike anything in her experience. "Maybe you should find a different job," she said quietly as they sat together on their living room couch. "There are other ways to make a living that don't involve being stalked by 1,500-pound bears." Alan considered his wife's suggestion seriously. At 43, he was young enough to learn a new trade, and their savings would carry them through a career transition if necessary. But fishing was more than just a job. It was a way of life that connected him to his father and grandfather, a tradition that defined his identity as much as any other aspect of his personality. "Let's see what happens in the next few days," he said finally. "If they find the bear and eliminate the threat, we can go back to normal fishing. If not, we'll have to consider our options." Martha nodded, understanding the difficult position her husband faced. Commercial fishing was one of the most dangerous occupations in the world under normal circumstances, and the addition of a stalking bear elevated the risks to levels that might not be acceptable for a man with responsibilities to his family and community. The second day of the search produced no sign of the bear, despite intensive efforts by wildlife officers and local hunters. The animal had apparently vanished into the vast wilderness of Kodiak Island, leaving behind only his trail of damaged fishing nets, claw-marked docks, and terrified fishermen. Chen reluctantly called off the active search, but warned that the bear remained at large and could surface again at any time. "We'll maintain patrols in the areas where he's been active," Chen told Alan, "and we'll respond immediately to any new sightings. But we can't keep a full search team deployed indefinitely. This animal is incredibly intelligent. He knows he's being hunted, and he's staying well hidden." Alan made the difficult decision to return to fishing despite the ongoing threat. The practical realities of his business demanded that he generate income, and the brief salmon season wouldn't wait for wildlife management issues to be resolved. He took additional precautions, carrying a rifle, working closer to shore, and maintaining constant radio contact with other fishing boats, but he couldn't eliminate the risks entirely. Patrick and Jeremy shared his concerns, but agreed to continue fishing together. They reasoned that there was safety in numbers, and that their combined vigilance would provide better protection than any of them could achieve working alone. They also invested in additional emergency equipment, flare guns, emergency locator beacons, and extra VHF radios that would help them summon assistance quickly if needed. Their return to fishing 3 days after the harbour incident was marked by extreme caution and constant vigilance. They chose to work areas they had never fished before, hoping to avoid any locations where the bear might expect to find them. The fishing was productive, but the constant stress of watching for signs of their pursuer made every day exhausting. For 2 weeks, their cautious approach seemed to be working. They encountered no signs of the bear, and other fishermen reported no unusual animal activity. Gradually, the immediate sense of danger began to fade, replaced by the normal rhythms of commercial fishing and the approach of winter weather that would soon end the salmon season. It was on December 1st, 2024, exactly 1 month after their first encounter with the bear, that their careful routine was shattered by a radio call that would change everything. The call came at 6:23 a.m. as they were preparing to deploy nets near Sitkalidak Island, 15 miles southeast of their original encounter location. All vessels, all vessels. This is Coast Guard Group Kodiak with an urgent marine information broadcast. We have reports of a large brown bear swimming approximately 3 miles southeast of Sitkalidak Island. The animal appears to be tracking commercial fishing vessels in the area. All mariners are advised to exercise extreme caution and report any bear sightings immediately. Coast Guard Group Kodiak out. Alan, Patrick and Jeremy listened to the broadcast in stunned silence. After 2 weeks of apparent normalcy, their tormentor had resurfaced in an area they had never fished before, somehow anticipating their presence or tracking them through methods they couldn't understand. "How is that possible?" Patrick asked, voicing the question that all 3 men were thinking. "We haven't fished anywhere near here before. How could he know we'd be here?" Jeremy was studying their position on the GPS, calculating distances and possibilities. Sitkalidak Island was 15 miles from their original encounter location and 10 miles from any area they had fished in recent weeks. For the bear to appear in this location at this time suggested either remarkable coincidence or a level of intelligence and planning that was genuinely frightening. "Maybe it's a different bear," Alan said hopefully, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Their hopes were dashed 20 minutes later when Jeremy spotted a familiar wake moving through the water approximately half a mile to their north. The V-shaped disturbance was identical to what they had observed during their original encounters, and its purposeful movement toward their boat left no doubt about the identity of its creator. "It's him," Jeremy said quietly, lowering the binoculars. "Same wake pattern, same distance, same behavior. He found us again." The implications were staggering. The bear had not only survived 2 weeks of intensive hunting by professional wildlife officers, but had somehow tracked them to a location they had never fished before. The level of intelligence and determination required for such behavior went far beyond anything documented in the scientific literature about brown bear cognition. Alan immediately radioed their position to the Coast Guard and began running toward the harbour at maximum speed. Behind them, the bear's wake maintained its parallel course, keeping pace with their 30-knot speed, as if the distance meant nothing to an animal of such size and power. "Coast Guard, this is fishing vessel Lucky Strike, WDF 2847. We are being pursued by the brown bear reported earlier. Our position is approximately 2 miles southeast of Sitkalidak Island, running toward Kodiak Harbour at maximum speed. The animal is maintaining pace with our vessel while swimming underwater. Request immediate assistance. Lucky Strike, this is Coast Guard Group Kodiak. Copy your situation. We are launching a helicopter and patrol boat to assist. Continue toward the harbour and maintain radio contact. Do not stop or alter course unless absolutely necessary." The helicopter arrived over their position in 18 minutes, its distinctive orange and white Coast Guard colours a welcome sight against the grey December sky. The aircraft circled their boat while its crew attempted to locate the swimming bear, but the animal had apparently submerged beyond visual range when the helicopter appeared. Lucky Strike, this is Coast Guard Rescue 6504. We have you in sight but cannot locate the bear. Are you still being followed? Alan studied the water around their boat, looking for any sign of the wake that had paralleled their course. The surface was empty of everything except wind-blown waves and the occasional seabird, but he knew better than to assume their pursuer had given up. Negative visual on the bear, Coast Guard. But he's done this before. Gone underwater when aircraft appeared, then surfaced again after they left. The helicopter maintained its patrol around the Lucky Strike for another 15 minutes before fuel considerations forced it to return to base. The crew promised to maintain radio contact and return immediately if the bear resurfaced, but the practical realities of aircraft operations meant they couldn't provide continuous coverage. Alan, Patrick and Jeremy completed their run to the harbour without further incident, but all three men knew they had simply postponed their confrontation with an animal that had demonstrated remarkable ability to find them, regardless of where they went or what precautions they took. The bear was no longer simply a wildlife management problem. It had become a personal threat that was targeting them specifically. That evening, Robert Chen convened an emergency meeting with the three fishermen and representatives from the Coast Guard, Alaska State Troopers, and Kodiak Police Department. The purpose was to develop a coordinated response to what had clearly become an unprecedented situation. "Gentlemen," Chen began, "we're dealing with a brown bear that's exhibiting behavior patterns unlike anything in the scientific literature. This animal has demonstrated the ability to track specific individuals over long distances, to anticipate their movements and to modify his own behavior in response to our countermeasures. We need to take this situation very seriously." Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander Sarah Rodriguez outlined the resources available for marine operations. "We can provide helicopter patrols during daylight hours and maintain radio contact with fishing vessels, but we don't have the capability to provide continuous protection for individual boats. Our primary mission is search and rescue, not wildlife management." Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Mike Thompson addressed the law enforcement aspects of the situation. "If this bear enters populated areas or directly threatens human life, we have the authority and equipment to respond. But as long as he stays in the water or wilderness areas, this remains primarily a fish and game issue." Chen acknowledged the limitations faced by each agency while emphasizing the unprecedented nature of the threat. "This animal has already demonstrated the willingness to enter populated areas and approach human habitation. Given his apparent focus on these three fishermen, there's a significant risk that he might escalate to more dangerous behavior if he's not found and eliminated soon." The meeting concluded with an agreement to maintain heightened patrols and response capabilities, but no one could offer a guarantee of protection if the bear continued his pursuit. Alan, Patrick and Jeremy left the meeting with a clear understanding that they were largely on their own in dealing with their unusual problem. "We could stop fishing for the season," Jeremy suggested as they walked back to their trucks. "Wait until he goes into hibernation or moves on to other activities." Alan was torn between the prudent course of staying ashore and the practical need to complete the fishing season. December was typically one of their most productive months, and the income generated during these final weeks often determined their financial situation through the winter. Missing the entire month could force them to sell their boat and find other employment. "One more day," Alan decided. "We'll try one more day, but with every precaution we can think of. If he shows up again, we're done until spring." December 2nd, 2024 dawned clear and calm, with light winds and unlimited visibility, perfect conditions for their planned final fishing trip of the season. Alan had spent the night aboard the Lucky Strike, monitoring the harbour for any signs of their persistent stalker, but had seen nothing unusual. The bear had apparently disappeared once again into the vastness of Kodiak's wilderness. They departed the harbour at 5:15 a.m., heading northwest toward Shuyak Island, where they hoped to make one final profitable set before ending their season. The area was known for large, late-season salmon, and several other boats had reported good catches there in recent days. More importantly, it was nearly 40 miles from any of their previous encounters with the bear. The run to Shuyak Island took 90 minutes through increasingly rough water as they moved into the more exposed areas of the Gulf of Alaska. The Lucky Strike handled the conditions well, but the motion was uncomfortable enough to make simple tasks like drinking coffee or checking equipment more challenging. "Beautiful morning," Patrick observed as they passed the northern tip of Afognak Island. The sun was just beginning to rise above the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reflected perfectly off the water. "Maybe we'll finally have a day without our furry friend." Jeremy was studying the GPS display and calculating their position relative to their previous encounters with the bear. 43 miles from our first sighting, 36 miles from yesterday's encounter. If he shows up here, we'll know for certain that he's tracking us through methods we don't understand. Alan was thinking about the same calculations, hoping that distance would finally provide the security they needed to fish without constant fear. The bear was undoubtedly powerful and intelligent, but there had to be limits to his ability to track them across the vast expanse of water surrounding Kodiak Island. They reached their intended fishing area at 6:47 a.m. and began preparing to deploy their nets in 90 feet of water, approximately 2 miles offshore from Shuyak Island. The fish finder showed promising marks, and several other boats working the area reported steady catches throughout the early morning hours. "This is it," Alan announced as he positioned the boat for their net deployment. "Our last set of the season. Let's make it count." The net went into the water smoothly, 400 feet of monofilament mesh designed to intercept salmon as they migrated along the underwater contours of the island's coast. Patrick worked efficiently in the stern, his movements automatic after decades of commercial fishing, while Jeremy monitored the radio and GPS systems. "Net's fishing," Patrick called, securing the final float line. "Perfect deployment, good depth, right on the contour line." He moved forward to join his companions in the boat's small wheelhouse. "Now we pray for fish and no bears." The weather was holding beautifully, with light winds and long-interval swells that barely affected the Lucky Strike's stability. Other fishing boats were scattered across the productive water, their presence providing a comforting sense of community and security. For the first time in weeks, Alan began to relax. At 7:23 a.m., Jeremy spotted the first sign that their hopes for a peaceful day were about to be shattered. "Movement on the water," he called, raising binoculars to study a disturbance approximately 1 mile to the southeast. "Something big swimming this way." Alan took the binoculars and immediately confirmed Jeremy's sighting. A large brown bear was swimming steadily toward their position, his massive head visible above the swells as he covered the distance with powerful rhythmic strokes. Even at nearly a mile away, the animal's size was apparent. "How did he find us?" Patrick asked, voicing the question that had haunted all three men since their encounters began. 40 miles from our last sighting, in an area we've never fished before. How is this possible?" Alan was already starting the engine and preparing to haul their nets, but he knew from experience that the bear could cover the remaining distance faster than they could retrieve their gear. "Get ready to cut the net loose if necessary," he ordered. "I'm not losing this boat to a bear." Jeremy was on the VHF radio, broadcasting their situation to the Coast Guard and other fishing vessels in the area. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is fishing vessel Lucky Strike WDF 2847, position approximately 2 miles northwest of Shuyak Island. We are being approached by a large brown bear while fishing. Request immediate assistance from any vessels in the area." The response was immediate from multiple sources. The Coast Guard acknowledged their distress call and began coordinating a helicopter response, while 3 other fishing boats in the area altered course to provide assistance. But all help was at least 20 minutes away, and the swimming bear would reach their position in less than 10. "There's something wrong with this situation," Alan said, studying the approaching bear through binoculars, while Patrick began hauling their net as quickly as possible. "Look at the way he's swimming. That's not normal behavior." Jeremy took the binoculars and studied the bear's approach. The animal was swimming directly toward them with unwavering purpose, showing none of the random course changes that might be expected from a bear simply crossing open water. His direction was precise, his stroke consistent, and his apparent destination unmistakably their boat. "He's been tracking us," Jeremy said with growing certainty. "Not following our wake or following scent. Actually tracking us like he knows exactly where we are at all times." The implications were terrifying. If the bear possessed some method of tracking them that they didn't understand, there would be no escape through distance or concealment. Anywhere they went, he would eventually find them, and his behavior was becoming increasingly aggressive with each encounter. The bear reached their position at 7:31 a.m., approaching the Lucky Strike from the port quarter, while Patrick continued his frantic efforts to retrieve their net. The animal was even larger than their previous sightings had suggested, easily 15 feet long and probably weighing close to 1,600 pounds. His small ears were pressed flat against his massive skull, and his eyes held an intelligence that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. "Cut the net," Alan ordered, as the bear closed to within 50 yards of their boat. "We're leaving now." Patrick reluctantly severed their net line, sacrificing several $100 worth of gear to maintain their mobility. The Lucky Strike was free to maneuver, but the bear was now close enough that his swimming ability was clearly superior to their boat's acceleration from a standing start. The bear reached the stern of the Lucky Strike at 7:33 a.m. and immediately attempted to haul himself out of the water onto the boat's transom. His massive claws found purchase on the aluminum gunnel, and Alan felt the boat's stern settle in the water as 1,600 pounds of bear began pulling himself aboard. "He's coming up!" Jeremy shouted, grabbing a gaff hook as the bear's massive shoulders appeared over the transom. "He's actually climbing onto the boat." What happened next would be debated by investigators, wildlife experts, and the fishing community for months afterward. The bear completed his climb onto the Lucky Strike's stern deck with surprising grace for an animal of his size, then stood on his hind legs to his full height of nearly 10 feet, surveying the 3 terrified fishermen who were trapped in the boat's small wheelhouse. Alan had his rifle in his hands and a clear shot at the bear's massive chest, but something about the animal's posture and behavior made him hesitate. The bear showed no signs of immediate aggression. He wasn't roaring, wasn't displaying the typical threat behaviors associated with an attacking brown bear. Instead, he seemed to be studying them with the same focused attention they had observed during their previous encounters. "Shoot him!" Patrick yelled, but Alan continued to hesitate, some instinct telling him that pulling the trigger would transform their situation from a wildlife encounter into a life-or-death battle that they might not survive. The bear remained standing on the stern deck for nearly 30 seconds, his massive head swiveling between the 3 men as if trying to understand something about their presence or their activities. Then, without warning, he dropped back to all fours and began systematically destroying everything within reach. The bear's attack on their equipment was methodical and thorough. He shredded their nets with precise claw swipes, crushed their fish boxes with casual blows from his massive paws, and tore apart their emergency equipment with the focused intensity of an animal searching for something specific. Within 2 minutes, he had reduced the Lucky Strike's stern deck to wreckage. "What is he looking for?" Jeremy asked, watching in fascination as the bear continued his systematic destruction of their equipment. "He's not just destroying things randomly, he's searching for something." Alan was beginning to understand the bear's behavior, and the realization filled him with a new kind of terror. The animal wasn't attacking them directly because they weren't what he wanted. He was searching their boat and equipment for something else, something that had drawn him to them repeatedly over the past month. "The salmon," Alan said quietly. "He's looking for our catch. He associates us with salmon, and he's trying to understand where we keep them." The bear completed his search of the stern deck and began moving forward, his massive bulk causing the Lucky Strike to list dangerously to port as his weight shifted toward the bow. Alan realized that the animal's continued presence aboard their 20-foot boat was threatening their stability and seaworthiness. "We have to get him off the boat," Alan said, raising his rifle again. "He's going to sink us if he stays aboard much longer." But before Alan could fire, the bear made his own decision about the situation. After completing his search of the boat and finding nothing of interest, he moved back to the stern and slipped into the water with the same grace he had displayed climbing aboard. Within seconds, he had disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only a swirl of disturbed water to mark his passage. The three men stood in stunned silence, surveying the wreckage of their equipment and trying to process what had just occurred. The bear had boarded their boat, searched it thoroughly, and departed without directly threatening their lives, behavior that was unlike anything in the scientific literature about brown bear attacks. "Coast Guard, this is Lucky Strike," Alan radioed, his voice shaking with delayed reaction to their encounter. "The bear has left our vessel and returned to the water. We are secure for now, but our equipment has been destroyed, requesting permission to return to harbor." "Lucky Strike, this is Coast Guard Rescue Helicopter 6504, now on station overhead. We have you in sight and are searching for the bear. Are you injured? Do you require medical assistance?" Alan looked at his companions, both of whom appeared shaken but uninjured. "Negative injuries, Coast Guard, but our fishing gear has been destroyed. We need to return to harbor for repairs and to report this incident to Fish and Game." The helicopter crew maintained station over the Lucky Strike for another 20 minutes, searching the surrounding water for any sign of the bear. But the animal had vanished as completely as he had appeared, leaving behind only the evidence of his visit and 3 fishermen who would never look at commercial fishing the same way again. The run back to Kodiak Harbor took place under helicopter escort, with Coast Guard crews maintaining continuous radio contact and visual surveillance. Other fishing boats in the area reported no bear sightings, and a systematic search of the water around Shuyak Island revealed no trace of their unusual visitor. Alan, Patrick, and Jeremy arrived at the harbor at 10:47 a.m. to find representatives from Fish and Game, the Coast Guard, and the Alaska State Troopers waiting to interview them. The story they told was unlike anything in the experience of the assembled officials, and it took several hours to document all the details of their encounter. "This is completely unprecedented," Robert Chen told the assembled group after listening to their account. "A brown bear that boards a commercial fishing vessel, conducts what appears to be a systematic search, then departs without harming the occupants. There's nothing in the literature that describes behavior like this." Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez was equally puzzled by the bear's actions. "From a marine safety perspective, we're dealing with an animal that represents a direct threat to commercial fishing operations. If he's willing to board boats at sea, he could cause capsizings, equipment failures, or direct injuries to crew members." Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Thompson addressed the law enforcement implications. "Given the escalating nature of these encounters and the direct threat to human life, we need to take immediate action to locate and eliminate this animal. He's moved beyond nuisance behavior into the category of a genuine public safety threat." The investigation that followed their December 2nd encounter would involve wildlife biologists, marine safety experts, and behavioral specialists from across Alaska and the lower 48 states. The bear's actions were so unusual that they attracted academic attention from researchers studying animal cognition and problem-solving behavior. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a wildlife behaviorist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, interviewed the three fishermen extensively about their observations of the bear's behavior. Her analysis suggested that they had encountered an individual animal with exceptional intelligence and problem-solving abilities. Brown bears are already among the most intelligent large mammals, Dr. Warren explained during a presentation to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. But this individual appears to have developed cognitive abilities that exceed anything we've documented in wild populations. His ability to track specific boats across long distances, anticipate their movements, and conduct systematic searches suggests a level of learning and planning that's truly remarkable. The search for the bear resumed immediately after their December 2nd encounter, with teams of wildlife officers, professional hunters, and volunteers scouring the waters and coastlines around Kodiak Island. Aircraft patrols were increased, and a substantial reward was offered for information leading to the bear's location. But despite intensive efforts involving dozens of people and thousands of dollars in resources, the bear remained elusive. He had apparently learned to avoid human searchers as effectively as he had learned to find specific fishing boats, demonstrating once again the intelligence that made him such an unusual adversary. Alan, Patrick, and Jeremy made the difficult decision to end their fishing season immediately following their December 2nd encounter. The financial cost was significant, but the risk of another confrontation with the bear was simply too great to justify continued operations. "It's not worth it," Alan told his wife Martha as they discussed their situation. "We've got insurance that will cover some of the equipment damage, and we can probably make it through the winter without the December income, but I'm not going back out there with that animal still free." Martha supported her husband's decision completely, having spent sleepless nights worrying about his safety since their encounters with the bear began. "There are other ways to make a living," she said, "ones that don't involve being stalked by 1,500-pound predators." Jeremy used the forced end to his fishing season as an opportunity to spend more time with his daughter Emma, something that had been difficult during the contentious divorce proceedings. The break from fishing allowed him to attend her soccer games, help with homework, and begin rebuilding their relationship. Patrick took a temporary job with a local construction company, using skills he had learned during the off-seasons to supplement their family's income. His wife Sarah was relieved to have him working on dry land, away from the unpredictable dangers of commercial fishing. The three men remained in close contact throughout December and January, sharing information about the ongoing search for the bear and discussing their plans for the future. The experience had bonded them in ways that went beyond their previous friendship and working relationship. On January 15th, 2025, Robert Chen called with news that brought mixed emotions. "We found him," Chen announced during a conference call with the three fishermen. "Or rather, we found what's left of him." A hiker discovered the carcass near a remote beach on the southeast side of the island. The bear's body had been found in a small cove approximately 20 miles from their last encounter, apparently having died of natural causes several weeks earlier. A necropsy performed by state veterinarians revealed that the animal had been suffering from a brain tumor that may have affected his behavior and decision-making abilities. The tumor was located in the frontal cortex, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the state veterinarian, explained to the assembled group. This area of the brain is responsible for complex problem-solving, learning, and behavioral planning. The tumor may have enhanced certain cognitive functions while disrupting others, potentially explaining the unusual behavior patterns you observed. The medical findings provided a scientific explanation for the bear's unprecedented behavior, but they also raised new questions about animal cognition and the potential effects of neurological conditions on wildlife behavior. The case would eventually be written up in several scientific journals as an example of how brain disorders could create dangerous situations for both animals and humans. For Alan, Patrick, and Jeremy, the bear's death brought closure to a chapter of their lives that had been marked by fear, fascination, and a grudging respect for an animal that had demonstrated remarkable intelligence even while threatening their livelihoods and safety. In a strange way, I'm going to miss him, Alan admitted during their final meeting with Fish and Game officials. He scared the hell out of us, cost us thousands of dollars, and nearly got us killed. But there was something magnificent about him too. You had to respect his intelligence and determination. The experience changed all three men's perspectives on commercial fishing and their relationship with the wildlife that shared their marine environment. They returned to fishing the following season with new safety protocols, better communication equipment, and a deeper appreciation for the unpredictable dangers that could arise from their chosen profession. Alan and Martha used their insurance settlement to upgrade their boat's safety equipment and install better fish storage systems that would reduce scent signatures that might attract unwanted attention from marine predators. Patrick invested in a partnership with a shore-based fish processing operation that would allow him to diversify his income sources. Jeremy used his break from fishing to complete a maritime safety instructor certification, preparing him for a potential career change if commercial fishing became too dangerous or unprofitable. The story of their encounters with the bear became legendary within Kodiak's fishing community, told and retold in bars and coffee shops throughout the island. Each telling added new details and interpretations, but the core facts remained consistent. 3 fishermen had been stalked by an extraordinarily intelligent brown bear for over a month, culminating in an encounter where the animal had actually boarded their boat and conducted a systematic search. Wildlife biologists studying the case concluded that they had witnessed a unique convergence of circumstances. An exceptionally intelligent individual animal affected by a brain condition that enhanced certain cognitive abilities while disrupting normal behavioral patterns. The combination had created a situation that was unprecedented in the scientific literature and unlikely to be repeated. Dr. Elizabeth Warren's research into the case became the foundation for new studies into animal cognition and the potential effects of neurological conditions on wildlife behavior. Her work suggested that intelligence in wild animals might be more variable and complex than previously understood, with individual animals capable of problem-solving abilities that far exceeded species norms under certain circumstances. The case also led to changes in wildlife management protocols, with new procedures for dealing with animals that exhibited unusual intelligence or behavioral patterns. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game developed new guidelines for responding to reports of animals that seemed to be tracking or stalking human activities, recognizing that traditional management approaches might be inadequate for dealing with exceptionally intelligent individuals. For the broader commercial fishing community, the story served as a reminder of the unpredictable nature of their work environment and the importance of maintaining vigilance and emergency preparedness. The ocean was home to powerful predators with capabilities that were not fully understood, and complacency could have deadly consequences. Alan, Patrick, and Jeremy continued fishing together for several more seasons, their partnership strengthened by their shared experience with the bear. They never encountered another animal that exhibited similar behavior, but their increased awareness and preparation served them well in dealing with the normal hazards of commercial fishing in Alaska waters. The Lucky Strike was eventually sold to a younger fisherman who was just starting his career, carrying with her the scars from the bear's visit and the stories of the 3 men who had survived an encounter that redefined their understanding of intelligence in the wild. Alan used the proceeds from the sale to purchase a larger, more modern vessel, better suited to the changing demands of commercial fishing. Years later, when asked about their experience with the bear, all three men expressed similar sentiments. They had been privileged to witness something extraordinary, an individual animal whose intelligence had transcended normal species boundaries, creating a situation that was both terrifying and fascinating. The bear had been a worthy adversary, deserving of respect, even as he threatened their lives and livelihoods. The cove where the bear's body was found became an informal memorial site, visited occasionally by wildlife researchers and members of the fishing community who wanted to pay their respects to an animal that had achieved legendary status through his remarkable intelligence and determination. His skull, preserved by the state veterinarians, became part of a research collection used to study the relationship between brain structure and cognitive ability in large mammals. The story of December 2nd, 2024, when a brown bear climbed aboard the Lucky Strike and changed three men's lives forever, became part of Kodiak Island's rich tradition of wildlife encounters and survival stories. It served as a reminder that the natural world still held mysteries and surprises, and that even the most experienced outdoorsmen could encounter situations that challenged their understanding of animal behavior and intelligence. In the end, the bear had achieved something remarkable. He had forced three experienced fishermen to see their world through different eyes, to recognize the intelligence and complexity of the wildlife they shared their environment with, and to approach their work with greater respect for the unpredictable dangers that could emerge from the depths of Alaska's wilderness waters. His legacy lived on in the stories they told, the precautions they took, and the deeper understanding they carried of the remarkable animals that called Kodiak Island home. The next stories. The Kodiak Nightmare. The morning fog clung to Katmai Bay like a burial shroud, its tendrils weaving between the towering Sitka spruces that lined the remote Alaskan coastline. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, 34, marine biologist from the University of Washington, adjusted her waterproof pack and checked her GPS coordinates for the third time in 10 minutes. The reading hadn't changed. 58 degrees, 30 minutes north, 154 degrees, 45 minutes west, precisely where their research vessel had dropped them off 6 hours earlier. But something felt wrong about this place, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand rigid despite the humid October air. "Sarah, you're overthinking this," called Marcus Rivera, 29, the expedition's wildlife photographer, as he secured his telephoto lens to his camera mount. Marcus had spent the better part of the last decade documenting predator behavior across North America, from the wolf packs of Yellowstone to the mountain lions of the Sierra Nevadas. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Sarah noticed the slight tremor in his fingers, the same nervous energy she'd observed in him whenever they were about to enter truly wild territory. The salmon run ended 3 weeks ago. Most of the bears should be heading inland to their denning sites by now. Dr. Say, James Hoffman, 41, the team's lead researcher and Sarah's former professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, looked up from his field notes with the kind of expression that had made him legendary among graduate students. Part skepticism, part curiosity, and wholly intimidating. His salt and pepper beard was already damp with morning moisture, and his steel-grey eyes reflected the overcast sky above them. "Should be, Marcus, but this has been an unusual year. The warming ocean temperatures have pushed the salmon runs later into the season. Park Service reported unusual brown bear activity as late as mid-October. Jennifer Walsh, 27, their field coordinator and survival expert, was methodically checking their bear spray canisters, her movements precise and economical. Jenny had grown up in rural Montana, the daughter of a hunting guide, and possessed an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings that had kept their previous expeditions safe on more than one occasion. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic before pursuing her degree in wilderness management, and her colleagues had learned to trust her instincts implicitly. "Hoffman's right," she said without looking up from her equipment check. "I've been monitoring the radio chatter from the ranger stations. They've had 3 separate encounters in this sector over the past 10 days, all involving sows with cubs. The 5th member of their team, Dr. Robert Chen, 38, a behavioral ecologist from Stanford, was already 50 meters ahead of the group. His attention focused on a series of large depressions in the soft earth near the tree line. Robert moved with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent years observing animals in their natural habitat, his movements deliberate and calculated. He joined the expedition to study the behavioral adaptations of coastal brown bears to changing environmental conditions, part of a larger research project funded by the National Science Foundation. "We've got fresh tracks here," he called back, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone else stop what they were doing. "Big ones, made sometime in the last 12 hours, maybe less." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she approached Robert's position. The tracks were indeed massive, nearly 13 inches long and 8 inches wide, with deep claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the toe impressions. The bear that had made these prints would have stood at least 4 feet at the shoulder, possibly weighing upward of 800 pounds. What disturbed her most, however, was the pattern of the tracks. They didn't follow the typical foraging path she'd expect from a bear moving between food sources. Instead, they seemed to meander, circling back on themselves, as if the animal had been patrolling. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, raising his camera to document the prints. "Those aren't just big, they're huge. And look at this." He pointed to a series of claw marks gouged deep into the bark of a nearby spruce, at least 8 feet off the ground. "This bear is marking territory." Dr. Hoffman knelt beside the tracks, his scientific curiosity overriding any sense of caution. He pulled out a small ruler and began taking measurements, photographing each print from multiple angles. "Ursus arctos middendorfi," he murmured, using the Latin name for Kodiak bears. "Based on these dimensions, I'd estimate this animal at 850 to 900 pounds, possibly larger. Adult male, probably between 10 and 15 years old." He paused, studying the depth of the impressions. "And given the clarity of these tracks in yesterday's rain, he passed through here sometime after midnight." Jennifer's radio crackled to life, startling everyone. The voice of Captain Martinez from their research vessel came through clearly despite the static. "Base camp to research team, over. Weather Service is reporting a storm front moving in from the northeast. Sustained winds of 40 to 50 knots. Seas building to 8 to 12 feet. We're going to have to move the vessel to more protected waters. Pickup is now scheduled for 1800 hours tomorrow instead of tonight. Over." "Copy that, Captain," Jennifer responded, though her expression suggested she was anything but pleased with this development. "We'll maintain radio contact on the hour. Research team out." She clipped the radio back to her belt and looked at the others. "So we're here for another night, in fresh bear territory." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Their original plan had called for a single day of data collection and sample gathering, followed by an evening extraction. Now they would need to establish a proper camp, which meant potentially attracting the attention of any wildlife in the area, with cooking odors, human scent, and general activity. Dr. Chen stood up from his examination of the tracks, brushing dirt from his hands. "Actually, this might work in our favor," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "If this bear is establishing territory in this area, we might get some unprecedented observational data. When was the last time anyone documented territorial behavior in coastal browns this late in the season?" "Robert," Sarah said carefully, "you're talking about observing an 800-pound predator that's clearly agitated about something. From what distance, exactly?" "The standard protocol is 100 meters minimum. Dr. Hoffman interjected, consulting his field manual. Though given the size of this animal and the confined nature of this terrain, I'd recommend 150 meters or more. Marcus was already calculating camera angles and lens requirements. With my 600 millimeters, I can get publication quality shots from 200 meters without any problem. The question is whether we'll be able to maintain that distance if we encounter this bear. Jennifer was studying their topographical map, her finger tracing the contours of the surrounding terrain. We're in a natural bottleneck here, she observed. Steep cliffs to the east, the bay to the west, and dense forest to the north and south. If a bear decides to investigate our camp, we don't have a lot of options for evasion. Which is exactly why we need to be extra careful about our campsite selection, Dr. Hoffman replied. Standard bear country protocols, food stored at least 200 meters downwind from our sleeping area, all scented items secured in bear canisters, no food preparation near the tents. As they began moving inland to select their campsite, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest around them seemed unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small mammals in the underbrush, just the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore behind them. She'd spent enough time in wilderness areas to know that this kind of silence usually meant one of two things. Either a major storm was approaching, or there was a large predator nearby. They found a suitable campsite on a small rise approximately 300 meters from the shoreline, a relatively flat area surrounded by mature spruce trees that would provide some wind protection. The site offered good visibility in all directions and had multiple escape routes through the forest. More importantly, it was located uphill from the creek where they would collect their water samples, ensuring that any food odors from their camp wouldn't concentrate near their primary research location. As they began setting up their equipment, Robert made another disturbing discovery. There are more tracks over here, he called from the eastern edge of their campsite. Different bear, smaller, but with cubs. Sarah joined him, and her blood ran cold. The new tracks were indeed smaller, only about 10 inches long, but they were accompanied by 2 sets of tiny prints, each no bigger than her palm. A mother bear with cubs was potentially far more dangerous than a lone male, especially if she perceived any threat to her offspring. "How old would you estimate the cubs to be?" she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Based on the size of these prints, probably born this past spring," Robert replied grimly. "Which means they'll be with their mother for at least another year, possibly 2. Marcus had been documenting the new tracks with his camera when he noticed something else. "Guys, come look at this." He was pointing to a large boulder about 20 meters away, its granite surface marked with long, deep scratches. "Those are fresh claw marks, and they go all the way around the rock." Jennifer approached the boulder with her rifle ready, though she kept it pointed safely toward the ground. The scratches were indeed fresh, the granite dust from the gouges still bright white against the weathered gray of the rock surface. "This is territorial marking," she said quietly. "Both bears have been through here recently, and at least one of them is claiming this area." Dr. Hoffman was taking measurements and photographs of the claw marks when he noticed something that made his scientific objectivity waver for the first time since they'd arrived. "These marks are unusual," he said slowly. "Typically bears mark trees, not rocks. And the pattern here, it's almost like the animal was agitated, maybe even aggressive." "Aggressive about what?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Competition for territory," Robert suggested. "The male bear's tracks suggest he's been patrolling this area regularly. If a sow with cubs moved into his territory, he might be trying to drive them out. Or," Jennifer said grimly, "the sow might be trying to protect her cubs from the male. Male brown bears are known to kill cubs to bring females back into estrus. The implications of this scenario were chilling. If they were camped in the middle of a territorial dispute between two bears, one an enormous male, the other a protective mother with cubs, their situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, the team established their research protocols with military precision. Jennifer set up a perimeter watch system, with each team member taking 2-hour shifts throughout the night. Marcus positioned his camera equipment at strategic locations around the campsite, using motion sensors and infrared triggers that would automatically photograph any large mammals approaching their area. Dr. Hoffman and Robert began cataloging and photographing all the bear sign they'd discovered, creating a detailed map of animal movement patterns in the immediate vicinity. Sarah focused on setting up their communication equipment and emergency protocols. She programmed their GPS beacon with the coordinates of the nearest ranger station, tested their satellite phone connection, and established radio check-in times with their research vessel. Every 30 minutes, she would broadcast their status and location to ensure that someone knew exactly where they were at all times. By 1600 hours, their camp was as secure as they could make it given the circumstances. Their food and toiletries were stored in bear-proof containers suspended from a cable stretched between two trees, positioned 200 meters downwind of their sleeping area and at least 15 feet off the ground. Their tents were arranged in a tight cluster with multiple escape routes, and their emergency signaling devices were within easy reach of every team member. But as the sun began to set behind the mountains to the west, casting long shadows across their campsite, Sarah noticed that the unnatural silence had not lifted. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying. Even the usual evening chorus of insects and small birds was absent, replaced by an oppressive quiet that made every small sound, the rustle of gear, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant lap of waves, seem unnaturally loud and threatening. Marcus was the first to see the bear. He'd been checking his camera equipment one final time before darkness fell when movement in the tree line caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a shadow or a trick of the fading light, but then the massive form separated itself from the darkness between the trees, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The bear was enormous, easily the largest brown bear any of them had ever seen outside of a zoo. Its shoulder height had to be at least 4.5 feet, and its bulk suggested a weight approaching 900 pounds, just as Dr. Hoffman had estimated from the tracks. Its coat was dark brown, almost black in the dim light, with the characteristic shoulder hump of a mature male. But what struck Marcus most was the animal's posture. It wasn't foraging or simply passing through. It was standing perfectly still, watching them. "Don't move," Marcus whispered, barely breathing the words. "Nobody move. We've got company." The bear stood at the edge of the tree line for nearly 5 minutes, its small eyes fixed on their campsite. It seemed to be assessing the situation, calculating whether these strange creatures represented a threat, competition, or merely in curiosity. Its massive head moved slowly from side to side, testing the air currents, gathering information through scent that humans could never perceive. Dr. Hoffman, despite every instinct screaming at him to run, began making careful observations. "Mature male, approximately 850 to 900 pounds as estimated," he whispered into his voice recorder. "Displaying investigative behavior rather than aggressive posturing. No huffing, jaw-popping or ear-pinning observed. Subject appears curious rather than threatened." But Robert, who had more experience with bear behavior than anyone else on the team, noticed something in the animal's stance that concerned him. "His head is low," he murmured. "That's not always a good sign. And look at his eyes. He's not breaking eye contact." Jennifer had slowly reached for her rifle, though she kept it pointed safely away from the bear. "Everyone stay calm," she said softly. "If he decides to investigate, we need to appear as large and intimidating as possible, but no sudden movements. The bear took a single step forward, its massive paw making no sound on the forest floor despite its size. Then another step. It was now less than 100 meters from their campsite, well within the distance that wildlife experts considered dangerous for an animal of this size. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to remember everything she'd learned about bear safety during her field training. Make yourself appear large. Speak in a calm, firm voice. Never run unless you have absolutely no other choice. Above all, never turn your back on the animal. "Hey, bear," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "We're just passing through. We don't want any trouble." The sound of her voice seemed to galvanize the bear. Its ears perked forward and its massive head tilted slightly to one side, like a dog trying to understand human speech. For a moment, Sarah thought it might actually be working, that the bear would lose interest and wander away. Instead, it took another step forward. "Jenny," Dr. Hoffman said quietly, his scientific objectivity finally giving way to genuine fear. "How good a shot are you with that rifle?" "Good enough," she replied, though her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "But I really don't want to find out unless we have no choice. A wounded bear is infinitely more dangerous than a curious one." The bear was now close enough that they could hear its breathing, deep, regular inhalations that spoke of an animal utterly confident in its dominance of this environment. It stopped again, perhaps 80 meters away, and went through another period of assessment. This time, however, its body language began to change. Its shoulders squared, its head lowered further, and it began to sway slightly from side to side. "That's not good," Robert whispered. "He's showing dominance behavior." Marcus, despite his terror, couldn't help but continue photographing the encounter. His camera's autofocus was working overtime, trying to lock onto the bear's form in the fading light, but he managed to capture several frames of the massive predator as it established its territorial claim over their campsite. The standoff continued for another 10 minutes, though to the research team it felt like hours. The bear would take a step forward, pause, then take another step. With each movement, it seemed to be testing their reaction, gauging their threat level, deciding whether they were worth the effort of a direct confrontation. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned and melted back into the forest. One moment it was there, a massive presence dominating their entire world, and the next it was gone, leaving only the memory of its small, intelligent eyes and the sound of their own ragged breathing. "Jesus Christ," Marcus exhaled, lowering his camera with shaking hands. "Did that really just happen?" "Everyone stay exactly where you are," Jennifer commanded, her rifle still ready. "Just because we can't see him doesn't mean he's gone. Bears can be incredibly stealthy when they want to be." They waited another 15 minutes before Jennifer finally allowed them to move, and even then only to gather closer together and discuss what had just occurred. The encounter had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it had fundamentally changed the nature of their situation. They were no longer researchers conducting fieldwork in bear habitat. They were potential prey being evaluated by one of North America's most formidable predators. "We need to reconsider our options," Dr. Hoffman said. Though his voice suggested he was struggling with the decision, "We could abort the mission, call for emergency extraction." In this weather, Sarah looked at the darkening sky where storm clouds were beginning to build on the horizon. Captain Martinez said the seas were already building. By the time they could get back here, we'll be dealing with 8-foot swells and 50-knot winds. "So we're stuck here for the night," Robert concluded, "with a 900-pound brown bear that's clearly established this area as his territory." Jennifer was already planning their defensive strategy. "We maintain the watch schedule, but we double up. 2 people awake at all times, positioned on opposite sides of the camp. If that bear comes back, we need to see him coming from as far away as possible." As full darkness fell over their campsite, the team settled into an uneasy routine. Marcus and Sarah took the first watch, positioning themselves at opposite ends of their small clearing with night vision equipment and handheld radios. The forest around them seemed alive with small sounds, the crack of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But every noise made them wonder if it might be something larger, more dangerous. At 2200 hours, they rotated the watch to Robert and Dr. Hoffman. The two men had worked together for years, and they fell into an easy pattern of quiet conversation, interspersed with careful observation of their surroundings. Robert's experience with nocturnal animal behavior made him particularly attuned to the subtle changes in the forest's rhythms, while Dr. Hoffman's systematic approach ensured that every sector was regularly monitored. It was during their watch, at approximately 23:30 hours, that they first heard the sound that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush, not making any attempt at stealth. Whatever was out there wanted them to know it was coming. "Wake the others," Robert whispered into his radio. "Now." Within seconds, Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer were awake and alert, their hands moving automatically to their emergency equipment. Jennifer had her rifle ready, while Marcus grabbed his camera and night vision equipment. Sarah activated their emergency beacon and began broadcasting their GPS coordinates on the emergency frequency. The sounds were getting closer, the heavy footfalls of a large animal moving with purpose rather than caution. And now they could hear something else, a series of huffing sounds that wildlife experts recognized as a sign of an agitated or aggressive bear. "He's back," Jennifer said grimly, "and he's not happy about something." The attack, when it came, was unlike anything any of them could have imagined. The bear burst from the tree line like a freight train, its massive bulk moving with shocking speed and agility. In the space of perhaps 3 seconds, it covered the 80 meters between the forest edge and their campsite, its powerful legs driving it forward with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. Jennifer got off one shot, the muzzle flash lighting up the night like a strobe light, but the bullet went wide as she dove sideways to avoid the bear's charge. The animal barely seemed to notice the gunshot, its attention focused entirely on the cluster of tents and the humans scrambling to get out of its way. Marcus, perhaps driven by professional instinct or simple shock, continued photographing the attack even as he backpedaled frantically away from the approaching bear. His camera's flash fired repeatedly, creating a surreal sequence of still frames that captured the pure fury and power of 900 pounds of muscle and claw, bearing down on them with murderous intent. Dr. Hoffman, despite his years of academic study of bear behavior, found himself completely unprepared for the reality of facing such a creature in full attack mode. The bear was nothing like the docile zoo animals he'd observed, or the theoretical predator he'd described in countless research papers. This was a force of nature, primal and unstoppable, driven by instincts honed over thousands of years of evolution. The bear's first target was their equipment cache, which it demolished with a single swipe of its massive paw. Expensive scientific instruments scattered across the campsite like toys, while the bear continued its charge toward the fleeing humans. Robert, who had been standing closest to the forest edge, suddenly found himself directly in the animal's path. He threw himself sideways behind a large boulder, feeling the bear's claws rake across the granite just inches from where his head had been moments before. The sound was like fingernails on a chalkboard, magnified 100 times, and it would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Sarah had managed to reach the emergency flare gun, and she fired it directly over the bear's head, hoping the bright light and loud noise might drive it away. The flare exploded in a shower of red sparks, illuminating the campsite in hellish crimson light, but the bear seemed completely unaffected. If anything, the flare seemed to enrage it further. The bear's attention fixed on Dr. Hoffman, who had become separated from the others during the initial chaos of the attack. He was running toward the tree line on the far side of the campsite, his field pack bouncing wildly on his shoulders when the bear changed direction and began pursuing him with terrifying single-minded focus. Jennifer had managed to work the bolt action of her rifle and chamber another round, but she couldn't get a clear shot with Dr. Hoffman directly in her line of fire. "James, get down!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of the attack. The bear caught Dr. Hoffman just as he reached the edge of the forest. The impact of 900 pounds hitting him at full speed drove him to the ground with such force that they heard the air being driven from his lungs in one explosive gasp. The bear's momentum carried both predator and prey into the tree line, where the sounds of the attack became muffled but no less horrifying. Jennifer finally had a clear shot, and she fired 3 rounds in rapid succession into the trees where Dr. Hoffman had disappeared. The gunshots echoed across the water, and for a moment there was complete silence, except for the ringing in their ears. Then they heard Dr. Hoffman scream. It was not a scream of surprise or fear, but of pure, unbearable agony. The sound of a human being torn apart by claws and teeth designed to kill animals much larger than themselves. The scream went on for nearly 10 seconds before it was abruptly cut short. "James!" Sarah called out, her voice breaking with hysteria. "James!" There was no answer from the forest, just the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, followed by an ominous silence that was somehow worse than the screaming had been. Marcus continued taking photographs, his professional training overriding his terror as he documented what might be the final moments of their lives. Through his camera's viewfinder, he could see movement in the trees where Dr. Hoffman had disappeared, but it was impossible to tell if it was the bear, their colleague, or something else entirely. Robert had managed to reach Jennifer's position behind a large spruce tree, and together they tried to formulate some kind of plan. The bear was still somewhere in the forest, possibly feeding, possibly just waiting for them to come looking for Dr. Hoffman. Their options were extremely limited. They could try to rescue their colleague and risk another attack, or they could attempt to escape and leave him to his fate. "We have to try to help him," Sarah said, though her voice shook with terror. "We can't just leave him." "Sarah, look at this objectively," Robert replied, his scientific training allowing him to maintain some measure of rationality even in the midst of the nightmare. "If James is still alive, any rescue attempt will likely result in multiple casualties. If he's not..." He didn't finish the sentence. Jennifer was monitoring their radio, hoping for some response from their research vessel, but the storm was interfering with communications. Static-filled voices occasionally came through, but it was impossible to determine if anyone was receiving their emergency broadcasts. The decision was made for them when they heard the bear crashing back through the forest toward their campsite. Whatever had happened to Dr. Hoffman, the animal was not finished with them. This time, they were better prepared. Jennifer had positioned herself behind solid cover with clear fields of fire, while Marcus and Sarah had moved to a rocky outcropping that would be difficult for the bear to climb. Robert had armed himself with a large piece of driftwood and a can of bear spray, though both seemed pitifully inadequate against an animal of this size and fury. The bear emerged from the tree line covered in blood, not its own blood. That much was immediately obvious. The dark stains on its muzzle and front legs told a story that none of them wanted to contemplate too closely. Dr. James Hoffman, respected researcher and dedicated teacher, was gone. The sight of their colleague's blood seemed to transform the remaining team members' terror into something harder and more focused: rage. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were fighting for their lives against a creature that had killed one of their friends. Jennifer's next shot was perfectly placed, catching the bear in the shoulder and spinning it sideways. The animal roared, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell, and stumbled momentarily before recovering and resuming its charge. But the wound had slowed it down, and Marcus had time to grab their emergency flare gun and fire directly at the bear's face. The flare struck the animal in the muzzle, burning fur and flesh, and finally caused it to pause in its attack. The bear shook its massive head, pawing at the burned area around its nose, and for a moment it seemed disoriented. Jennifer used the opportunity to fire 2 more shots, both finding their mark in the animal's chest and flank. Still, incredibly, the bear did not retreat. Wounded and partially blinded, it continued to search for them. Its sense of smell compromised by the flare burn, but its determination undiminished. It was as if the taste of human blood had triggered some primal hunting instinct that could only be satisfied by killing all of them. The final confrontation took place at the rocky outcropping where Sarah and Marcus had taken refuge. The bear, despite its wounds, managed to begin climbing the steep rock face with an agility that defied its massive size. Its claws found purchase in cracks between the granite slabs, and it pulled itself upward with methodical determination. Sarah found herself face to face with the wounded animal as it reached the top of the outcropping. She could see the intelligence in its small, dark eyes, could smell the metallic scent of blood and the wild musk of its fur. For one impossible moment, predator and prey stared at each other across a distance of less than 3 feet. Then Robert appeared behind the bear with the piece of driftwood, bringing it down with all his strength across the animal's skull. The impact was tremendous, and the bear collapsed onto the rocks, stunned but not dead. Jennifer's final shot, fired from point-blank range into the base of the bear's skull, ended the nightmare. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the sound of their own labored breathing and the distant crash of waves against the shore, the 4 survivors struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The massive bear lay motionless on the rocks, its blood pooling in the crevices between the granite slabs, while somewhere in the forest behind them lay the remains of their friend and colleague. The rescue, when it finally came 36 hours later, found them huddled together in the ruins of their campsite, dehydrated, exhausted and traumatized beyond anything their training had prepared them for. The Coast Guard helicopter crew would later report that it was one of the most disturbing scenes they had encountered in 20 years of emergency response operations. Dr. James Hoffman's body was recovered 2 days later by a team of park rangers and wildlife experts. The official cause of death was listed as massive trauma consistent with large predator attack, though the full details of his injuries were never released to the public at the request of his family. The bear, when examined by wildlife pathologists, was found to be suffering from an advanced brain tumor that had likely affected its behavior and judgment. The tumor explained the animal's unusual aggression and its failure to retreat when wounded, but it provided little comfort to the survivors, who would spend the rest of their lives reliving those terrible hours on the shore of Katmai Bay. Sarah Mitchell never returned to field research. She accepted a position with the National Marine Fisheries Service in Washington, D.C., where she could pursue her scientific career from behind a desk, far from any wilderness area where she might encounter the creatures that had taken her friend's life. She still wakes up some nights with the sound of Dr. Hoffman's final scream echoing in her ears. Marcus Rivera published a book of photographs documenting the attack, donating all proceeds to wildlife conservation efforts. His images of the bear's final charge became some of the most powerful and disturbing wildlife photographs ever published, though he has never been able to look at them without experiencing panic attacks. Jennifer Walsh left academia entirely and returned to Montana, where she now works as a hunting guide like her father before her. She carries bear spray and a large caliber rifle on every expedition, and her clients have learned not to ask why she becomes visibly nervous whenever they encounter fresh bear sign. Dr. Robert Chen continued his research, but focused his efforts on the behavioral effects of disease and environmental stress on wildlife populations. His work on the Katmai Bay attack became a landmark study in the field, though he has never published the personal details of that night when he was forced to kill a 900-pound grizzly bear with a piece of driftwood and sheer desperation. The campsite where Dr. Hoffman died has been permanently closed to researchers and visitors. Park officials erected a simple wooden cross at the location, engraved with the words, "Dr. James Hoffman, dedicated researcher and teacher, lost to the wilderness he loved." But on quiet nights when the wind is still and the fog rolls in from the bay, locals say you can sometimes hear sounds coming from that stretch of shoreline. Sounds like footsteps in the forest, or the distant echo of a man calling for help. The bears, of course, don't care about memorials or human grief. They continue to fish the streams, den in the mountains, and raise their cubs according to patterns established over thousands of years. For them, the death of Dr. James Hoffman was simply another day in a wilderness where survival belongs to the strongest, the fastest, and the most ruthless. And somewhere in the forests of Katmai Bay, other bears continue to mark their territory on trees and rocks, warning potential competitors that this land belongs to them and them alone. The nightmare, as Sarah Mitchell learned during many sleepless nights in the years that followed, is that nature doesn't care about human fears or human lives. It simply is, beautiful and terrible, magnificent and merciless, following rules written in blood and claw since the beginning of time. Dr. James Hoffman understood that, even as the bear's teeth closed around his throat. In his final moments, with the detached objectivity of a true scientist, he might even have appreciated the perfect, terrible efficiency of the predator that was ending his life. But appreciation and survival, as his colleagues discovered on that fog-shrouded shore, are two very different things. The next stories, The Last Stand at Willow Creek Ranch. The morning mist clung to the Montana wilderness like a shroud as Frank Dalton stepped onto the weathered porch of his ranch house, coffee mug steaming in the pre-dawn cold. At 63, Frank had weathered 4 decades of ranching in the shadow of the Absaroka Mountains. But something felt different this October morning. The horses were restless in their corral, their usual morning whinnies replaced by nervous snorts and the anxious stamping of hooves against the frost-hardened ground. Frank Dalton was a man carved from the same granite as the peaks that surrounded his property, standing 6'2", with shoulders broadened by decades of manual labor. His weathered hands told the story of every fence post driven, every bale of hay hefted, every difficult berth he'd helped deliver in the middle of a blizzard. His steel-gray hair, cropped short beneath his ever-present Stetson, framed a face marked by laugh lines and worry creases in equal measure. He'd inherited Willow Creek Ranch from his father, Samuel Dalton, who'd bought the land in 1952 with money saved from 3 tours in the Pacific during World War II. The ranch sprawled across 800 acres of prime grazing land, nestled in a valley where Willow Creek meandered through stands of aspen and lodgepole pine. The main house, built from local timber in the 1960s, sat on a slight rise overlooking the horse corral and barn, with the creek running behind the property like a silver ribbon. Frank's 8 horses were his pride and joy, a mix of quarter horses and paint horses that he'd bred and trained himself. There was Thunder, a 16-year-old black stallion with a white blaze, Sage, a gentle Palomino mare, Lightning, Thunder's spirited son, Misty, a grey mare with intelligent eyes, Copper, a chestnut gelding with a playful nature, Star, a pinto with a distinctive star marking on her forehead, Shadow, a dark bay mare, and Dancer, a young sorrel filly Frank had been training for his granddaughter. Frank's wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years earlier from cancer, leaving him alone on the ranch with only his border collie, Rex, for daily company. Their son, David, lived in Billings with his wife, Sarah, and their 10-year-old daughter, Emma. David worked as an insurance adjuster and visited the ranch monthly, always trying to convince his father to sell the property and move closer to town. Frank's daughter, Lisa, lived in Seattle working as a veterinarian. She called every Sunday without fail, but her visits were limited to holidays and family emergencies. The ranch sat 15 miles southeast of Bozeman, accessed by a gravel road that wound through national forest land for the final 5 miles. The nearest neighbor, Jim Bradley, lived 8 miles to the north with his wife Carol on a smaller spread focused on cattle. The Bradleys had been Frank's closest friends for 20 years, sharing the isolation and challenges of mountain ranching. Jim, a retired Forest Service ranger, often stopped by to check on Frank, especially during the harsh winter months when the road could be impassable for weeks. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, had been monitoring bear activity in the region for the past 2 seasons. At 34, Elena was considered one of the state's foremost experts on grizzly bear behavior and human-bear conflicts. Her research station, located 22 miles northeast of Frank's ranch, had documented an unusually large male grizzly that locals had nicknamed Big Jake. The bear had been tagged and collared 2 years earlier, weighing in at an estimated 650 pounds, making him one of the largest grizzlies on record in the lower 48 states. Big Jake's territory encompassed over 200 square miles of wilderness, including the drainage where Willow Creek Ranch was located. Elena's tracking data showed that the massive boar had been moving closer to human settlements over the past month, likely driven by the early onset of winter and a shortage of natural food sources. White bark pine nuts, a crucial pre-hibernation food for grizzlies, had been scarce due to a late spring frost, and the berry crop had failed after an unusually dry summer. Sheriff Tom Brennan of Park County had served in law enforcement for 26 years, the last 8 as sheriff. A Montana native who'd grown up on a ranch similar to Frank's, Tom understood the challenges and dangers of living in bear country. His department had responded to 14 bear-related incidents in the past year, ranging from garbage raids to livestock predation. Tom's deputies included veteran officers like Jack Martinez, who specialized in wildlife conflicts, and rookie Sarah Chen, fresh from the law enforcement academy but eager to learn. The morning of October 14th began with unseasonably warm temperatures that would climb into the mid-60s by noon, unusual for the season and elevation. Frank had noted this in his daily journal, a habit he'd maintained since taking over the ranch. The barometric pressure was dropping, indicating an approaching storm system that weather forecasters predicted would bring the first significant snowfall of the season. Frank's morning routine never varied. He woke at 5:30 a.m., made coffee using water from the ranch's artesian well, and stepped outside to assess the weather and check on his animals. Rex, now 12 years old but still alert, always accompanied him on this morning inspection. The dog had been showing signs of arthritis in his hind legs, but his protective instincts remained sharp. As Frank approached the horse corral, he noticed several troubling signs. The horses were clustered together in the far corner, their ears pinned back and their eyes showing white around the edges. Thunder, normally the calm leader of the herd, was pacing nervously along the fence line, pausing occasionally to stare toward the tree line that marked the beginning of national forest land. The corral itself was a testament to Frank's craftsmanship and attention to safety. Built from locally sourced lodgepole pine, the fence stood 6 feet high, with rails spaced close enough to prevent a horse from getting caught between them. The gate mechanism, which Frank had designed himself, featured a heavy-duty latch system that required deliberate manipulation to open. The fencing had withstood everything nature had thrown at it over the years. Windstorms that had knocked down trees, heavy snow loads, and even a minor earthquake 3 years earlier. Rex's behavior that morning was the first clear indicator that something was wrong. The The dog's hackles rose as he approached the corral, and he began to whine in a way Frank had never heard before. Rex moved in a low crouch, his nose working overtime to process scents that made him increasingly agitated. The dog's tail, usually wagging during morning rounds, was tucked tight against his body. Frank's weather-beaten hands tightened on his coffee mug as he scanned the tree line. In his 4 decades on the ranch, he'd encountered black bears dozens of times, and even a few grizzlies at a distance. Most encounters ended with the bear moving on after realizing humans were present. Frank kept his property clean of attractants. Garbage was stored in a bear-proof container, horse feed was kept in a sealed barn, and he'd never had a problem with bears approaching the buildings. The barn, constructed in 1978, stood 50 yards from the main house and 30 yards from the horse corral. Built from the same lodgepole pine as the fencing, it featured a metal roof and sliding doors large enough to accommodate farm equipment. Inside, Frank stored hay, grain, tack, and his tools. The structure had been designed with security in mind, featuring solid walls and minimal windows to protect valuable equipment and feed from both weather and potential thieves. At 6:15 a.m., Frank decided to investigate the horse's unusual behavior more thoroughly. He walked the perimeter of the corral, examining the ground for any signs of what might have spooked the animals. Near the northwest corner of the fencing, he discovered his first concrete evidence that something dangerous had been nearby during the night. The track was unlike anything Frank had seen in his decades on the ranch. Pressed deep into the soft earth near the creek was the unmistakable paw print of a massive grizzly bear. The print measured nearly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, with claw marks extending another 4 inches beyond the toes. The depth of the impression suggested an animal of extraordinary size and weight. Frank's blood ran cold as he knelt to examine the track more closely. His experience with bears told him this was no ordinary grizzly. The size of the print indicated a bear that likely weighed well over 600 pounds, possibly approaching the 700-pound range. Such bears were rare in the lower 48 states, and their presence near human habitation was cause for serious concern. Additional tracks led from the creek toward the horse corral, stopping just short of the fence line. Frank counted at least 6 clear prints, indicating the bear had spent considerable time investigating the area. The tracks showed that the animal had approached the corral, perhaps testing the fence, before retreating toward the creek and disappearing into the heavy timber. Rex's continued agitation confirmed Frank's growing alarm. The dog remained focused on the tree line, occasionally emitting a low growl that rumbled deep in his chest. Frank had never seen his loyal companion display such obvious fear, and the dog's instincts had proven reliable over the years. Frank's mind immediately turned to practical concerns. His horses represented not just his livelihood, but decades of careful breeding and training. Each animal had its own personality and history. Thunder had been Frank's riding horse for 15 years, carrying him through countless miles of mountain trails. Sage had produced 3 foals, including Lightning, who showed promise as a cutting horse. The younger horses represented the future of Frank's breeding program, and losing any of them would be devastating both emotionally and financially. At 6:45 a.m., Frank made the decision to move the horses to a more secure location. The ranch's secondary corral, located closer to the house and barn, featured higher fencing and better visibility from the main buildings. Moving the horses would require opening the gate and herding them across 50 yards of open ground, a task normally accomplished with Rex's help. Frank retrieved his rifle from the gun safe in his bedroom. The Remington 700 in 300 Winchester Magnum had been a gift from his father 40 years earlier. Frank was an accomplished marksman, maintaining his skills with regular practice at the informal shooting range he'd set up behind the barn. The rifle was equipped with a quality scope and was sighted for 200 yards, effective range for the open country around the ranch. Loading the magazine with premium ammunition designed for large game, Frank felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with deadly force. He'd killed 2 black bears over the years, both in defense of livestock, and he understood the gravity of potentially having to shoot a grizzly. Such bears were protected under the Endangered Species Act, and killing one, even in defense of property, would trigger a complex legal and bureaucratic process. Elena Rodriguez had spent the early morning hours at her research station, analyzing the latest data from Big Jake's GPS collar. The information troubled her deeply. The massive grizzly had been moving in a pattern that suggested increasing boldness around human habitation. Over the past week, the bear had visited 3 different ranches in the valley, always at night, always investigating livestock areas. Elena's research had identified several factors that were driving Big Jake's behavior. The failure of natural food sources meant that the bear needed to consume massive quantities of calories to prepare for hibernation. A male grizzly of Big Jake's size required up to 20,000 calories per day during the hyperphagia phase, the period of intensive feeding before winter. With natural food scarce, the bear was being drawn to the reliable food sources represented by human activity. The GPS data showed that Big Jake had spent over 2 hours in the vicinity of Willow Creek Ranch during the previous night, arriving around 2:30 a.m. and departing just before dawn. This was concerning behavior that indicated the bear was becoming increasingly comfortable around human structures and livestock. Elena had been trying to reach Frank Dalton by phone since 6 a.m., intending to warn him about Big Jake's presence in the area. However, the landline at the ranch went directly to an answering machine, and Frank didn't carry a cell phone, considering such devices unnecessary for his rural lifestyle. Elena left a detailed message explaining the situation and strongly recommending that Frank take immediate precautions to secure his livestock. At her research station, Elena maintained detailed files on every bear in her study area. Big Jake's file was thicker than most, documenting a bear that had shown increasing signs of problematic behavior over the past 2 seasons. The bear had been involved in several livestock predation incidents, though none had resulted in human injury. However, Elena's analysis suggested that Big Jake was approaching a threshold where human-bear conflict was becoming increasingly likely. The grizzly's physical condition was part of what made him so dangerous. At an estimated 650 to 700 pounds, Big Jake was in the top 1% of grizzly bears in terms of size and strength. His collar data showed that he maintained a massive territory and successfully dominated other bears through sheer physical intimidation. Such bears, when they decided to investigate human food sources, could cause tremendous damage in a very short time. Frank's attempt to move his horses began at 7:30 a.m. Opening the gate to the main corral, he used his voice and gestures to encourage the animals toward the smaller corral near the barn. Rex, despite his obvious anxiety, helped by positioning himself to guide the horses in the desired direction. The horses' nervousness made the task more difficult than usual. Thunder, normally responsive to Frank's commands, required several attempts before he would approach the gate. The other horses followed reluctantly, their ears constantly swiveling toward the tree line as they moved across the open ground. Sage, the Palomino mare, suddenly stopped halfway to the secondary corral and began backing up rapidly, her eyes wide with terror. Following her gaze, Frank saw movement in the shadows beneath the large spruce trees that marked the forest boundary. Big Jake emerged from the timber with the fluid grace of a predator that had claimed his territory. At full size, the grizzly was a magnificent and terrifying sight. His massive head, nearly 3 feet wide, featured the characteristic dished face and prominent shoulder hump that identified him as a mature male grizzly. His coat, a rich, dark brown with silver-tipped guard hairs, rippled over muscles developed through years of dominance in one of North America's harshest environments. The bear's appearance triggered immediate panic among the horses. Thunder reared and struck out with his front hooves, while Lightning bolted toward the barn. The other horses scattered in different directions, their survival instincts overriding years of domestication and training. Frank's first clear look at Big Jake confirmed his worst fears. This was no ordinary bear wandering through the area. The grizzly's posture and behavior indicated an animal that had lost much of its natural fear of humans. Instead of retreating at the sight and sound of people and domestic animals, Big Jake continued his steady approach toward the corral area. Rex positioned himself between Frank and the advancing bear, his protective instincts overcoming his fear. The border collie's hackles were fully raised, making him appear larger than his 65 pounds, but he remained silent, perhaps sensing that any sound might provoke an immediate attack. Frank raised his rifle, attempting to aim at the massive target moving toward him. However, the scattered horses complicated any potential shot. Sage was positioned directly between Frank and the bear, while Thunder continued to rear and strike, creating a chaotic scene that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Big Jake's attention seemed focused primarily on the horses, rather than on Frank himself. The bear's predatory instincts were fully engaged, and his massive size allowed him to move with surprising speed across the uneven ground. Grizzlies, despite weighing several hundred pounds, could reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any horse over short distances. The bear's hunting strategy became apparent as he cut off Sage's escape route toward the barn. With the fluid intelligence of an apex predator, Big Jake used the terrain and the horse's panic to his advantage. The mare found herself trapped between the bear and the fence of the main corral, with limited options for escape. Frank realized that his carefully planned horse relocation had become a disaster. Instead of moving his animals to safety, he had unwittingly placed them in the open during a grizzly bear's hunting approach. The secondary corral, which had seemed like a logical destination minutes earlier, now appeared impossibly distant across ground that Big Jake could cover in seconds. The sound that emerged from Big Jake's throat was unlike anything Frank had heard from a bear. Rather than the huffing or woofing typically associated with bear vocalizations, this was a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The sound spoke of power, hunger, and a complete lack of fear regarding the human presence in his chosen hunting ground. Sage's attempts to escape became increasingly desperate as Big Jake closed the distance. The mare's hooves slipped on the frost-slick grass as she tried to change direction, providing the bear with the opportunity he had been waiting for. With explosive power, Big Jake launched himself at the terrified horse. The collision between predator and prey occurred with shocking violence. Big Jake's massive jaws clamped down on Sage's neck, while his powerful front claws raked across her shoulders and chest. The mare's scream was cut short as the bear's bite severed vital structures in her throat, but her legs continued to thrash as her nervous system fought against the inevitable. Frank's rifle shot echoed across the valley, the 300 Winchester Magnum's report sharp and authoritative in the morning air. The bullet, fired from approximately 40 yards, struck Big Jake in the shoulder, penetrating several inches into muscle and fat, but failing to reach vital organs. For a bear of Big Jake's size and conditioning, the wound was painful, but far from incapacitating. The shot's primary effect was to focus the grizzly's attention fully on Frank for the first time. Big Jake released his grip on Sage, who collapsed but continued to struggle weakly, and turned toward the human who had dared to challenge him. The bear's small, dark eyes fixed on Frank with unmistakable intelligence and growing fury. Rex's loyalty overcame his survival instincts as the massive predator began advancing toward his master. The border collie launched himself at Big Jake, barking frantically and nipping at the bear's hind legs in an attempt to distract the massive carnivore. Rex's courage was admirable, but ultimately futile against an animal that outweighed him by more than 10 to 1. Big Jake's casual swipe with his right front paw sent Rex flying through the air to land hard against the barn wall. The dog's yelp was cut short as he struggled to regain his footing. his left rear leg clearly broken and his breathing labored from the impact. Frank's second shot missed entirely as his hands shook with adrenaline and fear. The bullet splintered bark from a pine tree 20 feet beyond Big Jake, who continued his relentless advance. The bear's shoulder wound was bleeding freely, matting the fur and leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the grass, but it had done little to slow the animal's momentum. The realization hit Frank with crystalline clarity. He was about to die. Despite 4 decades of living in bear country, despite his experience and preparation, he found himself facing a predator that was simply too large, too determined, and too close to stop with the tools at his disposal. Frank's final rifle shot was fired from a distance of less than 15 yards as Big Jake charged. The bullet entered the bear's chest, penetrating deeper than the previous shot, but still failing to strike the heart or lungs with sufficient damage to stop the attack. Big Jake's momentum carried him forward even as blood began to foam from his mouth, indicating lung damage that would prove fatal in time, but was insufficient to prevent the immediate confrontation. The impact as Big Jake struck Frank was devastating. At full charge, the 700-pound grizzly carried the force of a small automobile, knocking Frank backwards and sending his rifle spinning away across the grass. Frank's back struck the corner post of the horse corral with enough force to crack 2 ribs and drive the breath from his lungs. Big Jake's jaws closed around Frank's left shoulder, the bear's canine teeth measuring nearly 3 inches in length and designed for killing large prey. The crushing force of the bite, estimated at over 1,200 pounds per square inch, easily penetrated clothing and flesh to scrape against bone. Frank's scream echoed across the valley, a sound of agony and terror that would later haunt the memories of those who heard it. The grizzly's claws, measuring up to 4 inches in length and honed by years of digging and climbing, raked across Frank's chest and abdomen. The wounds were deep and devastating, opening arteries and severing muscle groups that had taken 63 years to develop. Blood soaked into the ground beneath the struggling man and bear, turning the frost-covered grass into crimson mud. Frank's attempts to fight back were brave but ineffective. His fists struck the bear's massive skull and snout repeatedly, but the impacts that would have staggered a human being barely registered with an animal whose head was protected by thick bone and powerful muscle. Frank's voice, when he could manage to produce sound between screams, called out for help that he knew was too far away to arrive in time. Big Jake's attack continued with the methodical efficiency of a predator that had killed large prey before. The bear's jaws released Frank's shoulder, only to clamp down on his right thigh, the teeth penetrating to the femur and causing damage that would have resulted in permanent disability even if Frank had survived the encounter. The other horses, scattered by the initial attack, remained in the vicinity but were too terrified to approach. Thunder, the black stallion who had served as Frank's mount for 15 years, stood trembling near the barn, his eyes wide with terror as he watched his human companion being systematically destroyed by the massive predator. Frank's consciousness began to fade as blood loss and shock took their toll. His vision narrowed to a tunnel focused on Big Jake's massive head, and his hearing became dominated by the sound of his own labored breathing and the wet, tearing sounds of the continuing attack. The pain, initially overwhelming, began to recede as his nervous system reached its limits. Lightning, Thunder's young son, made a valiant attempt to help his fallen caretaker. The horse charged at Big Jake from behind, his hooves striking the bear's hindquarters with considerable force. The attack was brave but ultimately futile, serving only to redirect the grizzly's attention temporarily away from Frank. Big Jake's response to Lightning's intervention was swift and decisive. The bear's massive paw, armed with claws that could tear through tree bark and flesh with equal ease, caught the horse across the face and neck. Lightning's charge became a stumbling fall as the claw wounds opened arteries in his throat, sending bright arterial blood spraying across the corral area. Frank witnessed Lightning's injury through the haze of his failing consciousness, the sight providing a final surge of desperate strength. With tremendous effort, he managed to pull his backup pistol, a .44 Magnum revolver, from its holster on his belt. The weapon represented his final chance to end the encounter before more of his beloved horses were killed or injured. The .44 Magnum's first shot, fired from a distance of less than 3 feet, struck Big Jake in the lower jaw, shattering bone and teeth but failing to penetrate into the brain. The bear's roar of pain and fury was muffled by the damage to his mouth, but the wound only seemed to increase his aggression rather than deterring further attack. Frank's second pistol shot entered Big Jake's left ear, the bullet penetrating into the brain and causing immediate neurological damage. The massive grizzly staggered, his coordination failing as the brain trauma affected his motor functions. However, the bear's size and conditioning allowed him to remain conscious and dangerous for several more crucial seconds. Big Jake's final attack was driven more by dying reflexes than conscious intent. His massive jaws closed around Frank's head and neck, the crushing pressure sufficient to fracture skull bones and compress vital structures in the throat. Frank's struggles ceased as consciousness fled, his body going limp beneath the weight of the mortally wounded predator. The grizzly's death was not immediate. For nearly 5 minutes after Frank's final shot, Big Jake remained partially mobile, though his movements became increasingly uncoordinated as brain damage progressed. The bear's massive body gradually settled onto Frank's motionless form, the predator's final breaths mixing with those of his human victim. Rex, despite his injuries, managed to drag himself across the corral area toward his fallen master. The border collie's whimpers and attempts to lick Frank's face provided a heartbreaking soundtrack to the scene of devastation that had unfolded in less than 10 minutes. Sage, the Palomino mare, who had been Big Jake's first victim, died from her injuries within minutes of the bear's initial attack. Lightning, despite the severe wounds to his throat, survived long enough to be discovered by rescuers, but would require extensive veterinary care to have any chance of recovery. The other horses gradually calmed as the immediate threat ended, though their behavior remained nervous and unpredictable for weeks afterward. Thunder, as the herd's leader, eventually approached the scene cautiously, his intelligence allowing him to understand that both the man who had cared for him and the predator that had threatened the herd were no longer moving. Jim Bradley's arrival at Willow Creek Ranch occurred purely by chance. The retired Forest Service ranger had planned to check on Frank as part of his regular routine, bringing fresh vegetables from his wife Carol's garden and hoping to share coffee and conversation with his longtime friend. Jim's truck crested the hill overlooking the ranch buildings at 9:15 a.m., nearly an hour after the attack had concluded. The scene that greeted Jim was one of obvious carnage. Even from a distance of several hundred yards, he could see the motionless forms near the horse corral and the scattered, agitated horses. Jim's experience with wildlife conflicts during his Forest Service career allowed him to recognize the aftermath of a predator attack, though the scale of what had occurred was beyond anything he had previously encountered. Jim's emergency call to 911 was logged at 9:18 a.m. His report to the Park County dispatcher was concise, but conveyed the urgency of the situation. "This is Jim Bradley. I'm at Frank Dalton's ranch on Willow Creek Road. There's been a bear attack. Frank appears to be down, and there's a dead bear on top of him. I need sheriff, ambulance, and fish and wildlife immediately." Sheriff Tom Brennan received the dispatch call while conducting a routine traffic stop on the interstate. The nature of the emergency caused him to immediately terminate the traffic contact and respond with lights and siren toward Willow Creek Ranch. Tom's experience with bear conflicts told him that a situation involving a human fatality would require coordination between multiple agencies and careful scene management. Elena Rodriguez's phone rang as she was reviewing the previous night's GPS data from Big Jake's collar. The call from Park County Dispatch requesting her immediate response to a fatal bear attack filled her with dread. The location given by the dispatcher matched exactly with Big Jake's most recent position data, confirming her worst fears about the massive grizzly's behavior. The first ambulance crew to respond, paramedics Jake Morrison and Lisa Chen from Bozeman Emergency Services, arrived at the ranch at 9:45 a.m. Their assessment of the scene was swift and professional, though both veterans were shaken by the extent of the carnage they discovered. Frank Dalton was clearly deceased, his injuries far beyond the scope of any medical intervention. The massive grizzly bear lying partially across Frank's body was also dead, though Jake Morrison approached cautiously and used a long pole to confirm the animal's condition before allowing Lisa to examine the human victim. Rex, the injured border collie, became the paramedics' primary focus for life-saving efforts. The dog's injuries were severe but potentially survivable with immediate veterinary care. Jake Morrison contacted Dr. Amanda Foster, a veterinarian in Bozeman, who specialized in emergency and trauma cases, requesting immediate consultation on treating the dog's injuries. Lightning's condition required expert assessment from a large animal veterinarian. Dr. Michael Thompson, who had provided veterinary services to Frank's ranch for over 15 years, responded to the emergency call and arrived at the scene at 10:30 a.m. His initial examination of the injured horse revealed wounds that were severe but potentially treatable with aggressive intervention. Sheriff Brennan established a perimeter around the attack scene to preserve evidence and coordinate the response of multiple agencies. His deputies, led by Jack Martinez, began photographing the scene and taking measurements to document the attack sequence for the official investigation that would be required. Elena Rodriguez's arrival at the ranch provided the wildlife expertise necessary to understand what had occurred. Her examination of Big Jake's carcass confirmed that this was indeed the collared bear from her research project, though she was shocked by the animal's size and condition. Big Jake appeared to have gained significant weight since his last capture, indicating that his foraging had been more successful than her natural food surveys had suggested. The GPS collar data recovered from Big Jake's carcass provided a detailed timeline of the bear's movements leading up to the attack. Elena's analysis showed that the grizzly had been in the immediate vicinity of the ranch for over 6 hours, arriving in the early hours of the morning and remaining hidden in the timber until the opportunity for predation presented itself. Frank's body was transported to the State Medical Examiner's office in Billings for autopsy, though the cause of death was obvious even to non-medical personnel. The official autopsy would document the extent of his injuries for legal and insurance purposes, but the examination was expected to be primarily procedural. Rex's transportation to Dr. Foster's clinic in Bozeman required careful handling due to his spinal injuries. The veterinarian's initial examination revealed a fractured pelvis and possible internal injuries, but the dog's vital signs remained stable enough to justify aggressive treatment. Lightning's treatment required Dr. Thompson to perform emergency surgery in the field to control bleeding and assess the extent of damage to the horse's throat and neck. The veterinarian's mobile surgical kit included equipment sufficient for major procedures, though the conditions were far from ideal. The investigation into the attack involved multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and responsibilities. Sheriff Brennan's office handled the human death investigation, while Elena Rodriguez represented Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks' interest in understanding the bear's behavior and preventing future conflicts. Federal involvement came through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which maintained regulatory authority over grizzly bears as a protected species. Agent Robert Kim arrived from Billings to ensure that the killing of Big Jake was justified under the regulations governing defense of life and property. The media response to the attack began within hours of the first emergency calls. Local television stations dispatched crews to cover what they quickly labeled as one of the most serious bear attacks in recent Montana history. The story gained national attention when details emerged about Frank's attempt to defend his horses and the size of the attacking bear. David Dalton, Frank's son, received notification of his father's death while at work in Billings. The drive to Willow Creek Ranch was the longest 90 minutes of David's life, as he struggled to process the violent end to his father's life and the destruction of the ranch that had been in the family for over 70 years. Lisa Dalton's flight from Seattle to Billings was arranged through the airline's emergency travel provisions. Her experience as a veterinarian provided her with a clinical understanding of trauma, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional impact of losing her father to a wild animal attack. The community response to Frank's death reflected the tight-knit nature of rural Montana life. Neighbors who had known Frank for decades organized to care for his surviving horses and maintain the ranch property while his family dealt with the immediate crisis. Carol Bradley, Jim's wife, coordinated meal preparation and support services for the extended Dalton family. Her efforts reflected the frontier tradition of communities rallying around families struck by tragedy, particularly tragedies related to the dangers of living in wild country. The investigation's findings would ultimately conclude that Frank Dalton had acted appropriately in attempting to defend his livestock from a dangerous predator. The wounds on Big Jake's carcass, combined with the recovered ammunition from Frank's weapons, supported the conclusion that the rancher had fought bravely, but had been overwhelmed by an exceptionally large and aggressive bear. Elena Rodriguez's analysis of the attack focused on understanding why Big Jake had become so bold around human habitation. Her research suggested that a combination of natural food shortages and the bear's exceptional size had created conditions that made conflict nearly inevitable. The tragedy at Willow Creek Ranch would influence bear management policies throughout the region. Rex's recovery at Dr. Foster's clinic became a symbol of survival and hope for the broader community affected by the attack. The Border Collie's progress was followed closely by local media, and his eventual return to health provided a positive outcome in an otherwise tragic situation. Lightning's survival also represented a victory against the odds. Dr. Thompson's skillful surgery and the horse's natural resilience combined to save the animal's life, though the scars from his encounter with Big Jake would remain visible for the rest of his days. The ranch property itself became the subject of family discussions about its future. David and Lisa faced the difficult decision of whether to maintain their father's legacy or sell the land where he had lived and died. The emotional weight of the attack site competed with family financial considerations and the practical challenges of managing a ranch from a distance. Big Jake's carcass was transported to the Montana State University Veterinary School for necropsy and research. The bear's exceptional size made him valuable for scientific study, and tissue samples would contribute to ongoing research into grizzly bear biology and behavior. The weapons used by Frank during the attack were retained as evidence during the investigation, but were eventually returned to his family. The rifles and pistol that had failed to save Frank's life became painful reminders of his final moments, though they also represented his courage in facing an overwhelming threat. Frank Dalton's funeral drew hundreds of attendees from throughout the region. The service reflected both his role in the ranching community and the tragic circumstances of his death. The pastor's eulogy emphasized Frank's devotion to his animals and his willingness to sacrifice his own life in an attempt to protect them. The long-term psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond Frank's immediate family. Jim Bradley, who had discovered the scene, required counseling to process the traumatic images that haunted his sleep. Other ranchers in the area reported increased anxiety about bear encounters and took additional precautions to protect their livestock and families. The scientific community's interest in Big Jake focused on understanding how such an exceptionally large bear had developed and what factors had driven him to such aggressive behavior. Elena Rodriguez's research would continue for years, using data from the attack to improve understanding of human-bear conflict. The legal proceedings following the attack were relatively straightforward, given the clear evidence of justifiable defense. However, the case established precedents for future incidents involving protected species and property defense. Frank's legacy lived on through the horses he had bred and trained. Thunder, Misty, Copper, Star, Shadow, and Dancer would eventually be relocated to other ranches where they could continue their lives away from the memories of that terrible morning. The Willow Creek Ranch property was eventually sold to a conservation organization that converted it into a wildlife research station. Elena Rodriguez's work continued at the location where Frank had died. Her research aimed at preventing future tragedies through better understanding of bear behavior and improved management strategies. The attack at Willow Creek Ranch remained a defining incident in Montana bear management for years to come. Frank Dalton's death, while tragic, contributed to knowledge and policies that would help protect both humans and bears in the ongoing challenge of coexistence in wild country. As autumn turned to winter in the months following the attack, snow covered the site where Frank had made his final stand. The natural cycle continued, indifferent to human tragedy, but the memory of one man's courage in defense of the animals he loved would endure in the hearts and minds of all who knew his story.